Okay.
All right, welcome everyone to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. As everyone knows, we are very passionate here about ideas. Ideas not from the simplistic, more popular standpoint of people who think of an idea as like I thought about cake, and cake is making me go to the store and do all of the things to eat my cake. That's a thought. That's a lower order thought, but it's not really an idea from the higher standpoint of the term, as far as that which really shapes our identities, how we mediate and map out our sense of reality of the universe we were born into, and our self-conceptions, those higher ideas that pertain to causation, the capital W-Y, that big word. Many people have been led to believe that the why question is really just a sick joke, an ephemeral like abstract, pointless word, because you can know how things are, but you can never know why things are, says the foolish wannabe wise person of the modern age. But we don't believe that. We believe that the word why is a really important thing, and kids ask it naturally. Right? They're very humble. They don't have any big gross assumptions blocking them from asking simple questions about, like, why is the sky blue, why is fire warm, like big questions. And if we got a sick culture that is trained out of us over time, that's beaten out of us, it's groomed out of us, we stop asking why, we just start learning how to like have acceptable ideas that are shared by experts, that are rewarded, that let us get jobs, prestige, but they don't actually satisfy the deeper yearning of the soul. So, Cynthia and I have had the privilege over the past 8-9 months of getting to know and become really good friends with the entire Holmes family. And many people here have probably watched some of our interactions, our interviews with Maycee, with Madison, with Mike, with Noel, with Kyle, with Sebastian. And one of the things that they really, really are fascinated by is the mind question and the mind brain relationship. And so we had heard of the name of Iain McGilchrist before, didn't really look too much into it until we started interacting with the Holmes clan, and became fascinated by something that he's bringing as a tool, a technique of analysis that I think has a lot of value, and that I think will encourage a good conversation. And Maycee's done quite a bit of work on a lot of the idea of the philosophy of mind and brain, that relationship. So she's been working now for some time at preparing this presentation, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation as well as the formal remarks. And like usual, I'm going to ask people after the main presentation is finished to put your names in the chat box, to throw out your thoughts, your questions to Maycee, and we'll go at it from there. So until then, Maycee, thank you so much for doing this, and it's all yours. Go for it.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm just gonna get started then in the screen sharing process. So let me know. Can everyone see this? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, I entitled this Gestalt being. It was funny in Matthew's Substack. He said the brain as the Gestalt equalizer. It's actually the brain is a great equalizer,
Damn.
but
Super sorry about that.
it's okay. But yeah, so I'm going to be talking about, as Matthew alluded to, a lot of work from Iain McGilchrist. So um we'll just get right into it. So the book that he wrote was The Master and His Emissary, and that was written in 2009 actually. And Dr. Iain McGilchrist is a former fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. When he taught literature before training in medicine. He is an associate fellow at Green Templeton College, Oxford, a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrics, a fellow at the Royal Society of Arts, a consultant emeritus of the Bethlehem and Maudsley Hospital, London, and has researched in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore. He's been studying neuroscience and neuropsychology and everything that comes with that for at least 30 years now. And I think it's beyond that, since his two new volumes, The Matter with Things, came out in 2021. So lots of prestige colleges that he's associated with. When I'm listening to Matthew and Cynthia's work, they always speak of the importance of context. One of the things I say to people when they ask how Matthew and Cynthia can be credited as historians and not just another historian feeding us false narratives is I almost always say they read it from the figure's mouth. They literally read these figures' books and try to dive into their minds because reading their work is like getting a feel for what they think, feel, and believe as a person. When you read Gilchrist's work, he brings the nuance to the brain. He even tries to say that by writing a book about the brain in in a reductionist form of text where the language doesn't leave much room for implicitness, he nevertheless can't get the information across. So it's us as the reader that will make it alive, and its understanding is not the sum of its parts, it's the gestalt. Your interaction with it is what makes it something beautiful. My family and I have read a lot of psychology works, and this by far trumped them all. And that's because this gave me the responsibility in being accountable to what's going on in my head. So often the brain gets a bad rap because I think so many psychologists and neuroscientists have co opted the brain that they never consider their own brain in trying to interpret the brain. Funny enough, Gilchrist falls prey to this in some extent. However, he was the one that pointed out that you cannot study neuropsychology without adopting a philosophical standpoint, which is very true. And unfortunately, those oligarchical figures chose to adopt what I know as a more left hemisphere worldview, even in what they thought was their pure objectivism. He references people like Carl Jung or Descartes and those who decided to do something as horrible as split a brain open, but he decided to take a detached view and take a look at what is physically manifesting with these subjects. So he didn't look into these people's motives, and of course, he put his own agenda, as we all do, into his work. However, he said his wish for people is to expand upon his work, to take it further. And I believe that's what Matthew and Cynthia and this group of people, along with my family, can and are attempting to do. So, oh, did that pop up? The little slide thingy?
We're still just seeing the Gestalt being main image.
Oh, you are?
Yep.
Oh. Are
If
we
you
seeing
open it,
this
oh,
now?
there you go. Yeah, now we're seeing a brain.
Oh, okay. So, one moment. I'm just kind of doing a little. Okay, so why care about the brain? I hear people say often, trust your gut, your heart, your instincts, but what makes one think any of those are separate from your brain? Another saying is, we are not just our brains. Carl Jung, Theodore Adorno, they think they understand the mind and they can use it to get control over us. They think they can become God. So this leads us, as the rational contextual thinkers we are, to make the statement, we are not just our brains. And I'm inclined to agree, but just because those oligarchs assume our mind is something that is mechanical, the sum of its parts, static, known, and therefore manipulable to any which way they choose, does not mean we have to do what we have to. In that statement, I think there's a degree of assuming we understand what the brain is as an object in order to say that we are not this thing. I believe we do have some control over our minds, but less exciting as taking drugs or creating and overanalyzing dreams and visions to come to a higher state of consciousness. I already think we're at a beautiful state of consciousness. I simply think we need to take responsibility for it. If we switch our mode of attention, I believe it will change what it is we come to find about the relationship we have with ourselves as people with brains. The reason I think it's important to acknowledge the statement is because, as contextual thinkers, it's important to think about the context that is the brain and even matter for that matter. The brain, as we know it, funny enough, using our brains, is comprised of neurons and gray and white matter and a corpus callosum and more complex cellular structures that we may or may not be aware of. So, if I was to say we are our brains, I could just lump us into some neurons and matter. However, that would be, as you'll soon see, taking a left hemisphere approach to how I could see the brain and how I could see us. However, if I adopt a bit more contextual thinking, I could ask how the brain gets to be what it is in the first place. The brain could be looked at from a right hemispheric understanding as a living thing. It is something that can specialize itself, adapt, constantly moving, transcending, and nothing but a lot of potential and change with impermanence. Like a river, we study our history so we can better understand how we got to where we are, what the patterns of our behaviors have been, where we've gone wrong, where we've gone right, taking in time to take in the context that is us. Our brains have a history too, and I think it's something that largely plays into our lived world of experience. But looked at even further, my brain doesn't get to be or act as it does without my body in the lived world of experience. And those neurons are completely shaped by experience, just living in the world, all of which there is a reciprocity. It's not a question of, did your brain come into the world first? No, it's you exist in the world, period. You have a brain. That, as we discussed, cannot be without the world. The matter that is your brain is also something that should not be dismissed. I was listening to a podcast by Dr. McGilchrist, and he said he likes to think of matter like another phase of consciousness. He compares it to water. Water has so many phases to it: liquid, ice, steam, and all of these phases have different ways of being. They don't look or act entirely the same. Ice is hard, steam is light and airy, liquid water is a bit in the in between, but all of them are still water, just different phases of it. So for me, I personally like to think of matter as another phase of consciousness in the sense that it very much holds value. I don't assume it does or doesn't hold intent, although that is a projection. But at the very least, I can't disprove that. It does a thing. And by thing, I don't mean stasis. I mean a lived contextual thing. And it can be both shaped and shaper of the world it reciprocally engages with. And that matter is what allows me to come up with the concepts of love and feel things, because that matter has a context, an environment surrounding it. So when someone is to make the statement, we are our brains, I take in the context of what the brain is, more specifically how it is and how it gets to be. What's the context surrounding the brain? And how I don't know, how I don't have a finite idea of what the concept even entirely means. Because as Max Planck said, we are part of the very mystery we're trying to solve. And if I did have an idea, I can either look at it using my brain in a more static left hemispheric model of understanding, or more right hemisphere living open one. But all that is to say, I think it depends on how we look at the statement in its missing context. Oh, can you guys see this? The debunking myths here.
Yep.
Okay. So, first problem is people already think they know it. So in Iain's work, he's challenging some axioms we have about the brain. Namely, the first myth pointed that the hemispheres have differences, but they're subtle, and for the most part, each play a role in everything we do. I feel like this is like saying all human beings breathe air. It's obvious the right hemisphere plays a role in everything we do. But the key word is role, as in what role? As Iain points out in his book, the point of making a comparison and looking at differences is to see what makes them unique, not generalized to a category such as saying a Volkswagen and Ferrari are both cars. They're more alike than different because they have engines, speedometers, etc. That's looking at them for their parts, and that does make them very similar if you attend to them with those sets of parameters of analysis. But how they perform is very different, much like our hemispheres. In his book, he uses the example of the surgeon and the scrub nurse. The surgeon has a very different role than the scrub nurse. Both are essential, though, for the operation. And importantly, touching on another myth, the value of each role is not distributed 50-50. The operation is far better served with the scrub nurse, but without the surgeon, it's almost impossible to successfully operate. The type of relationship each hemisphere has to one another and in the entirety of existence and on the individual circumstantial moments is of different proportions or ratios depending on those contexts. Which leads me to mode of attention as a moral act. So I have here a quote by Gilchrist in his book, and it says, "Through the direction and nature of our attention, we prove ourselves to be partners in creation, both of the world and of ourselves." So, a surgeon and a scrub nurse, huh? What makes them different? For starters, their mode of attention. My family and I have grounded how we solve problems mainly to understanding our mode of attention, and how if we shift our mode of attention, we can find ourselves discovering something new that we otherwise might not have considered. The mode of attention we pay to anything, be it outside ourselves or even ourselves, plays a crucial role in creation. We are quite literally co-creators of the world around us and of ourselves. Based on neurobiology, mirror neurons, when we look at someone performing an action or think about them doing an action or thinking about different sorts of people and their behavior, we measurably become more like them in how we behave, think, and feel. Even when we choose not to attend to something in a particular light, that does not mean we're not attending. It just may be less consciously layered, but nevertheless still a mode of attention. And that brings forth a different relationship. So why am I telling you this? Well, in Ian's work, he emphasizes the importance of attention as a moral act because what you make of the world is something that really physically manifests itself in the world. Attention is a creative act. He shows that the hemispheres have their own different modes of attention, and that means that it brings forth aspects of the world that we as people with hemispheres in our skulls and the world come together and bring about as a relationship. What we see determines what we find, and what we find shapes the world around us. It influences our mind and thoughts. It influences our decisions, and that plays out into the lived world of experience. So, a lot of what goes on in our brains, as many of us know, has to do with what goes on in the real world. If I attend to you with warmth and compassion, I can make you feel different than if I paid attention to you in a detached, analytic, objectified sense, or I make you feel small, alien, and isolated. So to me, the reason why delving into the hemisphere argument is important is because it's a large part of what makes us characteristically human. Even my ideas of what being human is and means and how I've gotten there is a reciprocal relationship between me as the thing doing the knowing and what I'm trying to know. And how I come to know anything, and by know, I mean how I come to articulate and formalize my life, is mediated through my body and my brain and the interweaved relationship they have to one another and that relationship to the world. Attention is not just another cognitive function that can be measured in the lab and stimulated by a machine, quoting Gilchrist. A machine can be directed towards something, but it cannot pay attention to it. A machine does not have intention. Paying attention, it literally describes a process, not a thing, and it brings forth a set of values. Values and through the way in which those functions are exercised. They can be used in different ways for different purposes to different ends. Language can be used in different ways for different purposes to different ends, all depending on your mode of attention or lack thereof. I have here a picture of my family and I looking at a mountain. There is more than one way to look at this mountain. For a geologist, it looks like a composition of different rock formations. To a painter, a multi-textured form with various shades and colors. To others, a dwelling place for the gods. To a climber, it looks like something to conquer. To a prospector, a source of wealth. And others, a landmark of beauty that can either be used to exploit or not. None of the ways of looking at this mountain is necessarily untrue. There is no one singular way to look at this mountain. All of them share a degree of truth. However, that does not suggest that the mountain can be whatever we want, solipsism, postmodernism, naive idealism. It's like a river. The river comes from the water and landscape coming together. The river isn't just the water, nor the landscape, but the coming together of the two creating something that is more than the sum of its parts. What a river provides is not what rain or land provide alone. Like an electric current, it's not in the current's not in the positive or negative terminal or even the space between, but the whole ensemble when it comes together, a symphony. Nor do we have no impact on what it is that we come to see. Naive realism, pure objectivism. It is your knowledge. Part of you is in it. Something of us goes into what we find there, as there is something to find, but it's more like meeting the world like meeting a friend. What we find there has some general common ground, but it's not identical in every experience, even by the same person. The falsehood of omnipotence and impotence both have in common seeing things in isolation rather than as connected, a mode of attention largely characteristic of the left hemisphere. Okay, so I have here a quote. How can we attend to our brains when it is us doing the attending? So this is a quote from Gilchrist that I will read as follows. Clearly, we have to inhabit the world of immediate bodily experience, the actual terrain in which we live, and where our engagement with the world takes place alongside our fellow human beings, and we need to inhabit it fully. Yet at the same time, we need to rise above the landscape in which we move, so that we can see what one might call the territory. To understand the landscape, we need both to go out into the felt, lived world of experience as far as possible, along what one might think of as the horizontal axis, but also to rise above it on the vertical axis, to live headlong at ground level without being able to pause, stand outside the immediate push of time, and rise in space is to be like an animal. Yet to float off up into the air is not to live at all, just to be a detached observing eye. One needs to bring what one has learned from one's ascent back into the world where life is going on, and incorporate it in such a way that it enriches experience and enables more of whatever it is that discloses itself to us to do just that. but it is still only on the ground that it will do so, not up in the air. Our frontal lobes have given us the ability to maintain a necessary distance between ourselves and the world, distance that can be used to both betray, exploit and use, and trust, consider, and empathize. That quote describes the world of the two hemispheres and the modes of attention they contribute to our lived world of experience. Our left hemisphere has a focused attention that is guided to the world of me, my needs, my ability to peck that seed, chase the rabbit, grab the fruit. I need to manipulate the world for my ends. On the other, our right hemisphere needs to be alert to everything that's around us, what we find ourselves surrounded with in the lived, possibility-ridden world. While I'm focused on this task, I need to look out for predators so I don't get eaten, pay attention to everything else that comes my way, and identify the individual peculiarities of friends and or foes, the pack with which I hunt, breed, and roam, the offspring that I must feed, and everything else that falls within my purview. A considerate, flexible, and open attention to whatever exists outside myself, the other. So the question is, how can we attend to our brains when it is us doing the attending? Simple, by using our brains. We have no choice. The right hemisphere is when we're on the horizontal axis, walking the terrain in the lived world of experience. The left hemisphere is when we're on the vertical axis, detached from the immediate lived world of experience, so that we can re-experience our experience, so that we can map out the lived terrain. Like how we all have cells in our body doing a thing that we know impact us and have some degree and are in some degree us, we don't know the ins and outs entirely, but we can know enough to help them better do their jobs. We can give them supplements, water, good food, oxygen. Much like working out a muscle in the gym, we can do that to get that particular muscle for all its capabilities, the ability to do its job better. And well, the brain is a muscle and it does a thing. Again, not a thing in stasis, but it has a process that is impermanence within permanence. It's not nothing and everything, it's something. And we can better train our muscle to do its job more effectively. So, in order to understand how we can best attend to our brain's different mode of attentions and therefore roles, we need to understand what the relationship is that the hemispheres have to one another. How do they best cooperate and what happens when they don't? So this story was actually presented in The Master and His Emissary because it was what inspired him to title it The Master and His Emissary. And it actually is in Nietzsche, but it goes as follows. There was once a wise spiritual master who was the ruler of a small but prosperous domain, and who was known for his selfless devotion to his people. As his people flourished and grew in number, the bounds of this small domain spread, and with it the need to trust implicitly the emissaries he sent to ensure the safety of its ever more distant parts. It was not just that it was impossible for him personally to order all that needed to be dealt with, as he wisely saw. He needed to keep his distance from and remain ignorant of such concerns. And so he nurtured and trained carefully his emissaries in order that they could be trusted. Eventually, however, his cleverest and most ambitious vizier, the one he most trusted to do his work, began to see himself as the master and used his position to advance his own wealth and influence. He saw his master's temperance and forbearance as weakness, not wisdom, and on his missions on the master's behalf, adopted his mantle as his own. The emissary became contemptuous of his master. And so it came about that the master was usurped, the people were duped, the domain became a tyranny, and eventually collapsed in ruin. The significance of this story is a little like our surgeon and scrub nurse analogy, but now let's apply this to ourselves. This is what's going on in your brain. It's a constant negotiation on an individual level, where our left hemisphere emissary usurps our right hemisphere master all the time. We betray ourselves all the time. Remember how I said people often say to trust your heart or instincts because you can find your mind or brain betraying you? Well, what if I told you that everything that is your instincts, your gut feeling, the physical sensations you feel in your heart when you read a sad novel or listening to a sorrowful piece of music, when your instincts tell you that a person can't be trusted, what if I told you all of that was mediated by your right hemisphere? And then what if I told you what you thought was your brain betraying you was actually you betraying your brain? Okay, so before we get into some of the examples of like the specifics of what the hemispheres do, I thought I would show a slide to the pathways to knowledge of how it is we come to actually attain the knowledge. So we study subjects with brain lesions, seeing what goes missing from those who suffered a stroke or tumor or other injury resulting in hemisphere damage in either hemisphere. We do we they do temporary experimental hemisphere inactivation, such as the WADA test, that's anesthetizing one half of the brain at a time while the other remains active. Then there's transcranial magnetic stimulation, which uses an electromagnet to enhance or depress activity temporarily in one hemisphere or at a specific location within the hemisphere. And then there's unilateral administration of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, where you could ask patients to carry out tasks knowing one hemisphere was inactivated for up to 15 to 20 minutes. And then there's also split brain patients, which have undergone a colostomy, which severs the corpus callosum. And then last but not least, neuroimaging, such as EEG, fMRI, SPECT, PET, all of which can tell us something about what areas of the brain are active during tasks. Iain does a good job at playing devil's advocate, though, to all these research methods and how they don't account for potential factors that should be considered in the inefficiency, like a good scientist does, which I actually kind of like about him. However, he does work well with their strengths and successes in helping us understand the brain. So, the new versus the known. Novel experience induces changes in the right hippocampus, but not the left. The right hemisphere can detect attention to what comes to us from the edges of our awareness, regardless of side, periphery. Anything newly entering our experiential world instantly triggers a release of noradrenaline, mainly in the right hemisphere. Neurons fatigue if continuously stimulated. They cease to respond. But noradrenaline, in response to new stimuli, is released and never fatigues. Its excitation condition is always active, so that exploratory attention is held open across space and time. The right hemisphere has a larger working memory, probably because of its ability to access more information and hold it together at once for longer periods. So naturally, as the story goes, our emissary doesn't attain any information without that of its master, the right. If it should turn out that the left cannot acquire anything new until it is first present to the right hemisphere, which neurologically the right hemisphere's ability to transfer information over to the left is faster than the left to the right. This plays in its nature in standing on the vertical axis to re-experience our experience. You cannot represent that which has not first been present. To represent something is to place it in stasis so that it is known. Placing things in stasis requires seeing them out of their context, analyzed as if an object or entity, which follows category versus individuality, general versus personal. The left is guided by utility. It's interested in what it has made, can grasp, manipulate, know all the ins and outs as to how it's supposed to work based on knowing the parts to construct a whole. That sounds like a machine, doesn't it? Again, it's not a question of what is done, but how it is done. Both the right and left hemispheres deal with categories or units and aggregates. The right deals with individual units in their contextual whole to which they belong and from which they are not divided, aggregate. More like a body of water, or perhaps a country with its regions and villages and people all vastly connected. Whereas the left sees parts, which go to make up a something which it recognizes by the category to which it belongs, like generally lumping things together. So take these two examples here. We have Capgras syndrome, which is thinking someone you know is represented by an imposter. And then we have Fregoli syndrome, which is thinking someone you know has been duplicated in different places at different times, like an item on an assembly line. So for Capgras and Fregoli, both imply seeing living unified wholes as either replicated or represented, seeing a living being as if they could be a thing to which it could be duplicated or to which it could be represented as by some imposter, as if you were something that could come out of a fax machine. With the Capgras syndrome, there was someone who thought his wife wasn't the same person because she got a new haircut. And when she got home, the patient thought she was a different person instead of considering that she's a living person and therefore belongs to a contextual whole, where there can be aspects of her that change and still be her because she's not static. He saw her as a part. Another example is people with Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia, which are characteristics of right hemisphere defect, actually. They showcase a passion for collecting and organizing. They are physical. There are more physical examples in this, though, in his work. So, highly recommend you read it. There was a patient with a right parietal occipital lesion. When asked to draw an elephant, only drew a tail, trunk, and an ear. And when asked to put together a model of an elephant, everything was distorted. This is an example on screen of someone with a right parietal lesion, and they were asked to draw a man, a bicycle, and a house. So clearly the left hemisphere lacks a bit of depth here. um, so making things known requires, as mentioned, that hyper-focused attention. It negates any existing context in order to see the target. That plays into the nature of the left when the right is not functioning. There was someone who suffered a right hemisphere stroke, and consequently his left hemisphere got fixated by inanimate objects in his right visual field. They literally got stuck looking at a door hinge and couldn't look away unless someone physically moved them, which is what my family and I call getting left locked. um, and then another thing to play off of the individuality versus category is that I was listening to a podcast by Gilchrist, and he was describing that this lady who lived in Switzerland had an infatuation with all of the different beautiful, different, I guess, bird life and bird species, and she could describe it beautifully. And then she suffered a right stroke, and then when asked what she thought, she said they all look the same. So that was actually quite sad to me when I thought of that. And then right here, this picture too is just to showcase that where the left hemisphere would see this as just a bunch of bits. If you actually see, and I'm going to give it away, it's actually a dog sniffing the ground under a tree. So the right hemisphere would be able to see the whole gestalt. Okay, so in order to place things in say stasis and see them as decontextualized so as to use them for your end, what kind of context surrounds the left hemisphere's ability to do that? For starters, it deals with what is abstract, so as to rise above the lived terrain and see it decontextualized, stripped of a lived context. It knows what it knows, and that's all it needs to know. There is no room for ambiguity. The left hemisphere deals with speech production and works with lexical information and semantics more than the right hemisphere. However, the right is specialized in pragmatics, the art of contextual understanding of meaning, and understanding metaphor, humor, irony, sarcasm, the moral of a story. Patients with right hemisphere damage cannot make inferences. They do not understand implicit meanings, whatever their kind, but detect explicit meanings only. The left identifies by labels, not context. It is the right that understands non-literal aspects of language. Subtle, unconscious perceptions that govern our reactions are picked up by the right hemisphere. Patients with right hemisphere damage have a hard time detecting a joke from a lie. An important thing to note here is that once an inference is made familiar enough and becomes more explicit, the transfer from the right superior temporal gyrus to the left is made. So what that means is basically you can, I guess, start to become familiarized with something to the point where it becomes so habitual and explicit that what was once new to the right hemisphere now gets processed over to the left hemisphere, and then it is made more explicit, and so it kind of loses its, I guess, nuance. In the case of the right hemisphere, there was an example where someone with left hemisphere damage relying on their right hemisphere was asked to copy a model using pieces of wood, and the patient actually took the pieces of wood and placed them on top of the model that they were supposed to copy, rather than reconstructing the model to the side. It was as though to signify the right hemisphere's inability to produce an abstract representation from a concrete model. Notice how I said concrete. To the right, everything is presenting itself. Nothing is ever static, but it's not everything. It's as with the lady and her birds, they are works of art. They do not mean to represent something else. They are beautiful in and of themselves for the impermanence they have in permanence. Okay, that is the end of that slide. So I have actually a couple examples here, like to show you guys. So On the left here is an example of the left hemisphere mechanism where it is showing decontextualized mental operations, and a right hemisphere mechanism that is context bound and incapable of abstraction. So I'll just read this for you. There is a syllogism with a false premise that is given. So the major premise is all monkeys climb trees. The second premise, minor premise, is the porcupine is a monkey. The implied conclusion, the porcupine climbs trees. Well, does it? So, as Deglin and Kingsborn demonstrated, each hemisphere has its own way of approaching this question. At the outset of their experiment, when the intact individual is asked, does the porcupine climb trees? She replies using, of course, both hemispheres. It does not climb. The porcupine runs on the ground. It's prickly. It's not a monkey. During the experimental temporary hemisphere inactivations, the left hemisphere is the very same individual with their right hemisphere inactivated, replies to that the conclusion is true. The porcupine climbs trees since it is a monkey. When that experimenter asks, but is the porcupine a monkey? She replies that she knows it is not. When the syllogism is presented again, however, she is a little nonplussed, but replies in the affirmative since that is what it is written on the card. When the right hemisphere of the same individual with the left hemisphere inactivated is asked if the syllogism is true, she replies, how can it climb trees? It's not a monkey. It is wrong here. If the experimenter points out that the conclusion must follow from the premises stated, she replies indignantly, but the porcupine is not a monkey. So it is the left hemisphere's disregard of its own senses to go with what is written on the card, whereas the right cannot abstract an idea that is taken out of the real world of lived experience. This plays into the oligarch's ability to game theory in the sense of come to false conclusions based on false premises, what my family and I refer to as the four truths, one lie. The lie is not just what the left hemisphere is pushing so as to get its way, although it definitely is. It's a lie to itself in its willingness to accept a false idea for the sake of certainty. Kind of like how in debate you're not negotiating to find the truth. You're trying to win an argument based on incomplete information, and you're sticking to it. And again, on the right, the left doesn't understand the context surrounding a situation. Here it says this is why the left hemisphere is not good at understanding the higher level meaning of utterances such as it's a bit hot in here today. While the right hemisphere understands please open a window, the left hemisphere assumes this is just helpful supply of meteorological data. So again, sorry, where did I lost my place? And again, on the right, the left doesn't understand the context surrounding a situation, so it just adopts the information as helpful data, kind of like the cult of interesting. But you don't actually do anything with the information to improve the situation for someone else. If it was hot, the left hemisphere, it would open a window, since remember, it's the world of me, not me in context with those around me. Okay, so we have embodiment versus disembodiment. The left hemisphere has to be disembodied, and by that I mean it has to see itself as separate from that which it is trying to use, and it sees itself as a detached observer to hunt its prey. It cannot empathize with the poor mouse field it wants to mangle. It has to remain clear-cut on the dichotomy of the situation. It sees living things as objects of use, prey, deals with body parts, not the whole part, as a living process. The left sees the body as an assemblage of parts. I've come across a lot of physical examples in The Matter with Things, Volume 1, and The Master and His Emissary about patients, 90% of whom are dealing with right hemisphere deficit, who suffer from hemi-neglect. The existence of the left half of your reality is gone. And they also suffer from, sorry if I butcher this, asatomagnosia. It's a failure to recognize parts of the embodied self, and also asognosia, failure to recognize a deficit. These subjects will confabulate stories to fill in the blanks about their condition. They're always pointing away from themselves and blaming others. I'll give a couple examples, but if you want more, highly recommend you read his work. He has his receipts. Through the research of split brain patients, it is almost always the left hemisphere that makes up stories to fill in the gaps. It hates uncertainty. But without the right hemisphere, the story is nonsensical. Because remember, if the right hemisphere is the only hemisphere that can give us new information, then when the left hemisphere goes to confabulate a story, it's kind of going in the memory banks of what was given to it and what it made more explicit. And that's, I guess, quote unquote, its stored memory bank. But that's how it'll pull in kind of absurd stories like how you see in maybe subjects with schizophrenia. Through the evidence, um, though the evidence presented in the works, the right hemisphere will not deny its defect, such as the left, but will actively not stop talking about and drawing attention to it. Perhaps because it is new and the right hemisphere has insight, because it is in tune with the body. So here's some examples. So we have an important early paper published in 1913. The Australian neurologist Herman Zingerle describes a 45-year-old clerk who had a stroke in the right temporal parietal region, resulting in neglect of the left side of space and his body. So we have that he never mentioned his paralysis, discarded it completely, and did not express any awkwardness about his handicap. He paid no attention to the left half of his body, seemed dismissive of it, and seemed to have completely forgotten about it. Even when his attention was drawn to the left side, he looked momentarily at, for example, his arm, and then took no further notice of it, and immediately began talking about something else. At the same time, he was quite aware that every person has a left and right side. He just didn't apply this to himself. If one started to talk about the left side of his body or ask questions concerning it, he suddenly went blank and appeared obliviously perplexed. He got embarrassed, made excuses, and became mute and inattentive, and it was impossible to evoke former memories of his left side. It was the same if the physician demonstrated the left side on his own body. The patient could recognize it, but this knowledge was irrelevant when applied to himself, and it did nothing whatsoever to prompt insight. If one persisted in trying to make clear to him the mismatch between his bizarre perceptions and the reality by reasoning with him or directing his gaze, he became more and more agitated, and there was no way he would come to an understanding. And so then we have another subject here, one subject reported by Bissac and his colleagues, Maria Risconi and Giuseppe Vallar, was absolutely convinced that her paralyzed left arm was her mother's. She could not by any means be dissuaded from this position and was dismissive when asked to explain what it was doing in her bed. However, amazingly enough, when her damaged right hemisphere was temporarily stimulated, again by caloric vestibular stimulation, her delusion was banished. She freely acknowledged the arm was hers and seemed puzzled as to why she was being asked whose arm it was. Once the right hemisphere stimulation wore off, however, she was once again quite adamant that the arm was her mother's. These findings have since been replicated. Other patients have claimed that the offending arm was made of plastic or that it was a dead hand someone had put in their bed. I can just continue actually in the reading here where it says a white woman thought hers belonged to a little black boy in bed with her. Another was convinced that the nurses had carelessly bundled up his arm with the dirty laundry and sent it away to be washed. Remember, when it comes to the left hemisphere, it's always someone else's fault. Okay. I included where is it? Explains very well. Sorry. Okay, I included this because it explains very well the kind of society we're in today. When COVID happened, so many people ate up the narrative that were being given to them because the left is more lateralized to fear, especially fear of uncertainty. When we're in a state of fear, which the left is one that primarily accesses the limbic system before that of the right, we look for quick solutions to make our left hemisphere feel comfortable with certainty in responding to the world, even if the conclusions are not probable. Because if the left's mode of attention is not meant to be, because the left's mode of attention is not meant to be receptive to all that is, because it's not even in tune with all that is as an embodied being, that it won't consider what the relations between things are because it doesn't see itself as in relation as an embodied entity. So what I have here is delusions may arise when the left hemisphere's tendency to explain goes awry. Indeed, delusional disorders are characterized by excessive inference making and the tendency to prematurely jump to conclusions. And Orrin Devinsky, the unchecked left hemisphere unleashes a creative narrator from the monitoring of self, memory, and reality by the frontal and right hemisphere areas, leading to excessive and false explanations. Further, the left hemisphere's cognitive style of categorization, often into dual categories, leads it to invent a duplicate or imposter to resolve conflicting information. Delusions result from right hemisphere lesions, but it is the left hemisphere that is deluded. One of the reasons schizophrenics are deluded is their tendency to jump to conclusions without weighing up overall whether these conclusions are probable. This is thought to be because of a need for closure, a tendency to prefer an answer, irrespective of its plausibility, to ambiguity and uncertainty. This is a tendency that is also reflected in the culture of modernity. It encourages us all to rush for closure. When told that there are 125 sheep and 5 dogs in a flock, and then asked how old is the shepherd, 3 out of 4 school children will produce a numerical answer rather than reply that there is not enough information. So right there is basically the idea of the left hemisphere is not willing to say it doesn't know something. It has to have an answer. And whereas the right hemisphere, those school children that would say there isn't enough information, the right hemisphere needs to consider context first. So now I was mentioning the limbic system and how the left hemisphere is more quick to grab it first. It's because the right hemisphere is going to take its time to consider the context of the situation and not rush in. So that's why I included that COVID example, because I definitely think that they placated to our left hemispheres in that case. Okay, so the left hemisphere won't budge to any evidence presented to it that could indicate something is amiss. There's a strong tendency to disown problems, fail to take responsibility, and to maintain to the last that it has nothing to do with it. The right hemisphere damaged, left hemisphere reliant patient is always right. So here I have a few examples. So this was someone with submota peripheria, or actually any right hemisphere deficit delusional state, including schizophrenia, will scarcely ever budge from their delusion in the face of any kind of evidence. And actually, they said it's important to note that these people didn't express any sort of form of delusion at first. And then when they got into this state, obviously something was going amiss. But here's a woman with a paralyzed left arm. Examiner, what is this over here? Take a look over here, indicating patient's left hand. What is this? Patient, your fingers. Examiner, take a good look. What is it? Taps the back of the patient's hand. Patient, the back of your hand. Examiner, the back of my hand. Patient, yes. Suppose I told you that this was your hand. Patient, I wouldn't believe you. Examiner, you wouldn't believe me. Patient, no, no. Examiner, this is your hand. Patient, no. That one makes me laugh like every time. So yes, as you can see in the face of evidence, it is hell bent that this is not the way that it is. I have another thing actually that points to the left hemisphere's proclivity to go and blame other people for its own defects. And this is right here. It says, a colleague told me the story of one of his neglect patients who had hit his car on the left side no less than 6 times while driving it into the garage. The patient said, my garage was designed by a friend who is an architect, he said. Some friend. He has come back and changed the size of the garage entrance without telling me. Now I see who is my friend. And to think for so many years he was just pretending to be kind to me. So yeah, there you go. So right here, it's important to note though that the only time someone recognized the deficit, like when a left hemisphere patient, or I guess right hemisphere damaged patient relying on the left hemisphere, the only time they actually recognized the deficit was if they could blame it on someone else. There was a case where the doctor pretended to inject something in the patient's arm, saying it would paralyze it, and then she confirmed to the idea. And Notice how the doctor had to explicitly say it's going to paralyze it, because again, it works with explicit information. The left hemisphere searches for what is outside itself. It is self-referential in what it thinks it knows, like an echo chamber. But when it comes to applying anything wrong with itself, it reaches for something to blame. Again, it lacks insight. Okay, so time, emotion, and the self. The right hemisphere can follow a narrative, can consider context, whereas the left cannot, probably because of the right hemisphere's ability to sustain attention, memory, understand the continuity of time, and holds together the relationship between things, seeing the whole gestalt as opposed to the bits. Bits are only seen when fragmented, decontextualized. As the analogy went, the right has to live headlong at ground level without being able to pause, stand outside the immediate push of time, and rise in space is to be like an animal. Yet to float off up into the air is not to live at all, just to be a detached observing eye. There's a difference between I live time and I live in time. Which one do you think is more detached and suggests that the person is separating themselves from the process that they as a living thing is living? So I think that I will go ahead and read these first, and then I will explain my thought process after. So palapamnesia is a condition in where there is a disturbance and fragmentation of the normal flow of visual experience, or abnormal persistence over time of images, causing visual trails. It is caused by posterior right hemisphere lesions. Loss of fluidity of motion through time and other modalities than sight are associated with deficits in the right posterior cortex. So that is basically the left hemisphere has a loss of fluidity of motion in time. And then there's here an inability to recognize faces is called prosopagnosia and follows right hemisphere lesions. In 1947, Joachim Bodemer described a patient with prosopagnosia, reported that faces seemed to him strangely flat, white with emphatic dark eyes, as if made from a flat surface, like white oval plates all alike. So actually, before I feel like we could maybe get this one in there. Actually, yeah. So there are links here with the right hemisphere's tendency to melancholy. If a tendency for the right hemisphere to be more sorrowful and prone to depression is true, this can, in my view, be seen as related not only to being more in touch with what's going on, but more in touch with and concerned for others. No man is an island. It is the right hemisphere of the human brain that ensures that we feel part of the main. The more we are aware of and empathically connected to whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, the more we are likely to suffer. Sadness and empathy are highly correlated. This can be seen in studies of children and adolescents. There is also a direct correlation between sadness and empathy on the one hand and feelings of guilt, shame, and responsibility on the other. Psychopaths who have no sense of guilt, shame, or responsibility have deficits in the right frontal lobe, particularly the right ventromedia and orbital frontal cortex. So time and memory go hand in hand. If it is the master that must maintain an open receptiveness to the gestalt and live the terrain, it has to understand time as a part of the very foundation in which all context about itself and the world around us flows. Having a sustained and alert attention is holding memory, potential, and context, all of which can't be possible without living time. But that means living time is seeing yourself as a living being and understanding that you don't get the living without the living. If the left hemisphere thinks of itself as living in time instead of living time, it is decontextualized, disembodied. So remember how we were talking about insight? Well, having insight into understanding one's illness or defect is, I think, related to the right hemisphere's ability to focus on the other. The right hemisphere has insight into how we are likely to seem or come across to others. The right inferior parietal lobe plays a crucial role both in planning and monitoring the outcomes of one's own actions. In schizophrenia, when there is predominantly right hemisphere defect, remember it is then delusions arise about reality. And this plays because it is the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex which counterbalances our biases and reason. When we do that, we're more apt to take in context and more oriented to others. The right hemisphere doesn't differentiate itself from the other, as it knows we do not get to be us without others and the surroundings we find ourselves. We're shaped by it and have the ability to shape it. The right hemisphere can only understand the other and its self by being embodied beings in time. Embodied as in the body. The body is very communicative of emotion, is highly intuitive, not explicit, and is grounded in empathy, understanding the whole, is the relation between things, not isolated entities, and it is strongly associated with the right hemisphere, all of which goes into understanding living beings. The right hemisphere can understand the implicit. How does it do that? Well, the right hemisphere recognizes and remembers faces, as well as voice, gesture, body language. It gives us our ability to recognize individuals and their uniqueness. Reading the face is important in identifying individual quiddity and in reading emotions, empathy. Emotions that are related to empathy, be it positive or negative, are mediated by the right hemisphere. Such stimuli capture the right hemisphere's attention. The right hemisphere is associated with understanding and expression of emotion and regulation. It is crucial for emotional control, which is interesting as those patients who were getting irritated upon the spotlight being directed on them plays into the fact that anger is largely left lateralized and is the hardest emotion for the right hemisphere to regulate. Empathy comes from imitation and not just copying someone by rote, but as mentioned in the beginning, even looking at certain people doing things activates our mirror neurons, sometimes even against our will. Our ability to apprehend the whole as living beings alongside other fellow living beings through the right hemisphere ability to understand and express emotion results in us trying to feel what that must be like from the inside. We inhabit the other person, which plays in the development of values, which forms part of our individuality. This plays in the right hemisphere's ability to recognize our sense of self as one with a personal history and emotional memory. It is very impaired upon right hemisphere injury. Right frontal damage impairs the sense of self over time. Remember, the left can't follow a narrative, not even your own. Those with damage to the right frontal temporal cortex may experience a cognitive detachment from self, remembering that the right hem recognizes units, as in their individuality, within a contextual environment to which they belong that is not separate from it, and remembering that the left hemisphere doesn't apply what it thinks it knows to itself. It blames, and the only time it'll recognize a defect is if it can have someone to blame for it. I think that's because of its dominance to categorize and abstract and therefore decontextualize, and its inability to recognize faces and read emotions and understand implicit meanings. It doesn't recognize the other, and therefore it doesn't recognize the individuality that is itself. There can be nothing wrong with it if it doesn't have insight based on emotional bodily awareness through understanding you're an entity that lives time. It literally can't recognize body parts or even half of your reality. And this plays into gut feeling instinctively. Working memory and non-verbal information crucial to intuition and gut feeling depends on the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The right anterior insula and the frontoinsular cortex, when not functioning properly, results in poor performance in social tasks as seen in autistic subjects. When overactive, these areas in the brain that are responsible for gut feeling and social tasks and interaction, it results in what is the antithesis of autism, Williams syndrome, which is hypersocial, highly empathic, anxious to please behavior. So that would be an idea of the right hemisphere's realm. So I have here some examples of how the left hemisphere has this detached sense of self. So core features of dissociation include amnesia for autobiographical information, identity disturbances, depersonalization, and derealization, lack of the sense of the reality of the phenomenal world, which appears to be a two-dimensional projection. On first principles, one would therefore expect this to be a right hemisphere deficit condition. And subjects with right hemisphere damage do in fact report exactly this, a change in and foreignness of the self, which is disconnected from the world, a loss of feeling of belonging in the world. At times, they report having become insensible automata, puppets, or mere spectators, devoid of feeling and cut off from the surrounding world. One even reported that her head had been turned into a cone, but with the front part missing. Other patients reported feeling themselves to be just a casing or cover, their eye having been separated from them, located outside the body somewhere to the left. So then we also have here A right frontal temporal network in the brain seems critical for distinguishing the self from others. When subjects are shown a picture of their face, regions in the right hemisphere are activated. There was a study where a subject was shown a picture of their face meshed with that of a famous person, and that those with an activated left hemisphere leaned to pick the famous person over their own. And the converse is true when the right hemisphere was activated, which is done with the WADA test. So the left deals with public rather than personal knowledge. And then right here, we also have there's a deviant sense of responsibility with the left hemisphere. In an experiment designed to test how the left hemisphere interprets causation, information fed to the left hemisphere resulted in individuals attributing their successes to internal, stable, and global causes, while failures were blamed on external, unstable, and specific causes. So it says here right frontal damage, especially in the region of the inferior frontal gyrus, can cause fatuous optimism. Using transcranial magnetic stimulation to suppress the right inferior frontal gyrus caused healthy participants to become abnormally optimistic about what would happen in the future compared with their normal state. In keeping with this, facilitating the right hemisphere reduced unreasonable optimism. And this one is an example of kind of what I said previously, so we can move on. But just the importance of this slide is the fact that it's like the left hemisphere has this undue optimism of the self, and then it can't even, and in conjunction with its ability to not recognize a defect. And then it, like I mentioned, it deals with public rather than personal knowledge. And then also here, it can have a sense of detachment from itself. So then this leads to the left hemisphere, the corpus callosum. So the left hemisphere has more of the ability to inhibit the right hemisphere, which accounts for its dominating nature. By inhibit, I mean there is a thick band of neural tissue called the corpus callosum, which is said to be the thing that connects the hemisphere's ability to communicate with one another. That is true, but Iain goes a step further to suggest it's predominantly meant to inhibit the hemisphere's communication, a sort of keep out of it modality. Although the majority of cells projecting to the corpus callosum use the facilitatory neurotransmitter glutamate and are excitatory, there are significant populations of nerve cells whose function is inhibitory. Even the excitatory fibers often terminate on intermediary neurons or interneurons whose function is inhibitory. Now, inhibition has a sort of negative connotation, but that doesn't mean stopping function on either hemisphere. It could mean allowing for something else to come forward. Saying no, as well as not saying no, also known as the absence of no, both allow different aspects of things to come forth in the lived world. What can be shown with the left hemisphere's predominance with having a more inhibitory effect on the right hemisphere as opposed to the other way around is that subjects with early left hemisphere brain damage, so therefore relying on their right, I believe, in whom therefore language has to be accommodated in the right hemisphere alongside normal right hemisphere faculties, show IQ deficits in their nonverbal functions because the presence of language in the same hemisphere interferes. The direction of influence tends again to be more that of the left hemisphere over the right. It doesn't trust what it doesn't know, and because it cannot know the world of the right, it does not trust. There was a split brain patient, and they were choosing different articles of clothing with one hand, and the other hemisphere was choosing other clothes. Or let's say one of them flipped a page and the other hand would flip it back. And this person was using their verbal left hemisphere on describing what was going on, and they called their left hand the naughty hand because their left hemisphere couldn't understand what was going on in the other hemisphere, the right hemisphere, and why it was doing things it didn't will itself. The left hemisphere didn't will itself. So it said its left hand was bad. And that's because it couldn't have certainty to get a hold of the other part of itself. Now, this is an example here that I'll read of how the right hemisphere can actually account for the perspective of the left hemisphere and use the tools of the left. And there's multiple examples of this, but this is just an example. So some interesting sidelights on the relationship between the hemispheres can be seen by examining the way in which these individual differences affect competition for the control of visual attention. In experiments where a task is carried requiring attention to one's non-favored visual field, the field contralateral to one's non-favored hemisphere, While irrelevant, distracting information is presented to the favored visual field, those subjects with a characteristic left hemisphere bias found that the already strong tendency for the left hemisphere to prioritize the right visual field and downplay the left visual field was enhanced. This meant that the irrelevant information on the right interfered with the task going on the left visual field, controlled by the right hemisphere. But for those with a characteristic right hemisphere bias, when conditions were reversed, no such competitive effects were seen. Irrelevant information in the right hemisphere's favored left visual field did not interfere with the subject's ability to attend to the matter in hand going on now in the right visual field, the field favored by the left hemisphere. This suggests a more even distribution of concern in the right hemisphere than in the left. We know that the right hemisphere looks out for both hemispheres' territory, not just its own, like the left hemisphere. But this goes further, having a utilization bias in favor of the left hemisphere, and this is like normal people actually, so they just actually did this towards regular Joes like you and me, and showed tasks going on in different of our different visual fields. And it said that in having a utilization bias in favor of the left hemisphere intensifies this effect, whereas having a similar bias in favor of the right hemisphere does nothing to upset the even-handedness of its concerns. This resonates with another well-established research finding that transfer of information from left hemisphere to right hemisphere takes place more slowly than transfer from right to left. And be it noted, this is regardless of whether the task is by nature better suited to the right hemisphere or left hemisphere. Okay, language and the hand. So the left pars apicularis, which is part of Broca's area, which is the area critical for speech production of the frontal lobe, contains mirror neurons, which are involved in the imitation of finger movements. The relationship between referential language and the hand, particularly the right hand, is an interesting one. Ever notice when toddlers babble or identify objects, it accompanies some sort of pointing or grasping? In his book, he puts forth the importance that gesture and how gesture often precedes talking and conversation. Language and the act of grasping share many commonalities. Both focus in on attaining something, bring precision and fixity, essential components to manipulating the world. And unfortunately, language plays a role in manipulating other human beings. We can hide things in language. We're less able to hide things in our body language. But language can be used to act on someone at a distance. Manipulation is not entirely a bad thing. It can allow us to have influence on what we can control and change and make new. It allows for the virtual representation of reality, language. Language, which again is strongly left lateralized, allows for the left hemisphere to conceptualize the world from an offline virtual axis, separated from the world of experience, but ultimately embedded in it. After all, language, as in metaphor, only gets to come from the world of experience and returns to the world of experience. However, it can take on a life of its own, a life of some of the language can take on some of the life of the things it represents. So I have here this quote that I will read actually. And it says, all of this grasping, this taking control, this piecemeal apprehension of the world, this distinguishing of types rather than of individual things takes place for the most of us with the right hand. And so it is not surprising that in these reflections are clues to the nature of left hemisphere processes. In all these respects, not just in the taking control, but in the approach to understanding by building it up bit by bit rather than being able to sense the whole, the interest in categories of things rather than in individuals, grasp follows a path congenial to the operations of the left hemisphere. It is also through grasping things that we grant things certainty and fixity. When they are either uncertain or unfixed, we say we cannot put our finger on it. We haven't got a hold of it. This, too, is an important aspect of the world according to the left hemisphere. The idea of grasping implies seizing a thing for ourselves, for use, wrestling it away from its context, holding it fast, focusing on it. The grasp we have, our understanding in this sense, is the expression of our will, and it is a means to power. It is what enables us to manipulate, literally to take a handful of whatever we need and thereby to dominate the world around us. I mentioned metaphor and how language comes from the world of experience. Even describing, I cannot put my finger on it, as in this quote, I haven't got a hold of it, shows that language is a form of life, grounded in experience. But when it tries to detach itself from the body and the lived world of experience to which it belongs, a metaphor is knowledge. Sorry. But when it tries to detach itself from the body and the lived world of experience, to which it belongs, it becomes, I guess, well, detached. A metaphor is knowledge as distinctions, in which we come to understand any one thing only by comparing it with something else we already know, and compare the differences and similarities. The model we choose to understand something determines what we find. If it is the case that our understanding is an effect of the metaphors we choose, it is also true that it is a cause. Our understanding itself guides the choice of metaphor by which we understand it. This plays into an interview I was watching with Matthew and Courtney, and how if we use formulae to fit our model, then we just use our confirmation bias of trying to force a square peg in a round hole. It's like you're trying to make math or what is it? I think it's they mentioned saying trying to make math or physics conform to the mathematical formula instead of the formula actually conforming to the reality of what's going on in the real world. So then this leads me to this quote, which is, if we assume a purely mechanical universe and take the machine as our model, we will uncover the view that, surprise, surprise, the body and the brain with it is a machine. To a man with a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. You can compare it with the machine if you wish, but the analogy is bound to be a poor one in every respect, except, of course, whatever it is that the body and machine have in common, and that is all the comparison will reveal. The catch is that to those who have brought into this model as the way to illumination, everything about the body will come to look more and more mechanical, and so the model comes to seem more and more apt. The original choice eventually seems confirmed as a perfect fit. So what I got from this is that you need more models. If we do inevitably choose models, which I don't think the right hemisphere does, but I think it allows the left its model because it's an absence of no. Remember, it doesn't inhibit the left hemisphere as much as left does the right. It has an open receptiveness, hence why it has a harder time inhibiting the left hemisphere than left does the right, because the left will just continue towards what it thinks it knows. Failure to the left hemisphere isn't failure to change one's model or point of view. Failure to it is not going further in the same direction you were already traveling. Considering another's point of view and changing your own would require recognizing your bias, which requires insight, an ability to understand you're not separate from the other, which requires empathy, and the ability to read emotion, body language, implicit meanings, so as to relate to individuals and their context and your context, and seeing how your initial hypothesis might be wrong because perhaps of the way you were raised, the mode of attention you're choosing to come at looking at the situation, maybe you got to shift the parameters. All of this relates, I think, to the realm of the right hemisphere and not choosing a model. And if it did, I think it would be the model of expansion, taking in all sorts of possible models, like the master in the story, and holding it together, not just focused in on what the emissary is trained to do, which is focus on the parts. And so just to do a little recapitulation, this is a very left hemisphere way of going about presenting the differences, but that's well, kind of actually almost intuitive now. It's based on what I've told you. But yeah, so the left is definitely abstract versus the right, which is more contextualized. It's category versus identification, general versus unique, certainty versus possibility, quantification versus qualification, fixity versus flow, disembodiment versus embodiment, parts versus wholes, known versus new, explicit versus implicit, optimistic versus realistic, represented versus present, and inanimate versus inanimate. And so I actually just want to make a little bit of a highlight, which is that again, it's not necessarily like even I don't really like the dichotomy in that either. The whole point of my presentation is I'm representing a knowledge which is I guess already intuitively and implicitly within us. When I'm listening to Matthew and Cynthia's work all the time, I'll listen to them talk about, I guess, the oligarchy, and I'll listen to them talk about people like Benjamin Franklin, and my brain goes like, oh my gosh, that's the hemispheres, because remember that this is well, you have a brain, so this is what's going on in your head. So this is not necessarily as dichotomous, which is why I encourage to people to read the work, because I feel like, as I said in the beginning, that's where your creative flow and individuality will arise from the process, and then it won't be, you'll be laughing because you'll see that it's not entirely just that. But yeah, so two more slides and then we are good for questions. So oligarchs left hemisphere gone rogue. So what went wrong in the story of the master and his emissary? What does the world of the left hemisphere look like if it's betraying the master? I think it's the left doesn't ping to the right hemisphere. The ratio, the pendulum becomes imbalanced and you start swinging from one side to the other. The right does absence of no, right? So it doesn't inhibit the left as much as the left does the right. And as we saw with those subjects that weren't able to do the task in the non-favored visual field, again, it's the left hemisphere that becomes more enhanced. It's the left hemisphere that becomes locked on the door hinge kind of thing. So if it does not keep itself in its lane, because the right hemisphere is very absence of no, then it overreaches and the right won't say no. That's not what it does. The oligarchs don't change their model of thinking, as we were talking about, because language and the hand are very much rooted in the sense of like even the metaphors we choose to talk about the world and our understanding is embedded in a lived context. And the models the oligarchs choose to understand the world, this mechanistic model, they don't change it because of us. If we don't understand what's going on, then we're not in a better position to do something about it. Your hemispheres have different ways of attending to the world. You can be detached so as to be the surgeon to save a life, or you can be detached so as to manipulate people. To me, this isn't about good and evil, although if the interaction between the hemispheres isn't in keeping with the one that understands reality in its flowing state of ever changing, ever present possibilities directed towards being open towards others and therefore ourselves, in its ability to empathize and therefore to change our own biases, to take responsibility for the world around us as living beings, part of this world, then we become oligarchs ourselves who, in our fear of uncertainty and persistence for knowing on a generalized game theory of what the world is according to a set of fixed principles and formulas that are themselves not grounded in experience because half of your brain cannot understand the other half of experience, then you are left with an incomplete model. And an example of that, actually, that I talk about around my household too, is that if there's someone in a psych ward that literally thinks that they're on fire because they have something like that's going kind of wrong, um, I could look at them with two functioning hemispheres and kind of go like, that's not true. And I have the experience and the embodiment to recognize that because one of my hemispheres, the right hemisphere, is able to do this thing. They are not able to do this thing. Now, does that mean that what their version of reality is untrue? Not to them, but what I say is their model is incomplete. And then I would go a step further and say that not all models are created equal. Almost like unity makes room for division. Division doesn't really make room for unity. So it's like my hemispheric model with both my functioning hemispheres makes room for the fact that it's like, okay, I can recognize that this is what's going on, but then them conversingly would look at us and be like, if we're saying you're not on fire, they won't believe us. So the reason I think divide and conquer strategy works is because of us. We make divisions where there are none in nature. Our brains are divided. That is a natural division. But our hemispheres are not static things. They are a process and have a way of being based on their mode of attention. And if we're not careful, we will get left locked on thinking we understand that which a part of us literally cannot understand. And we will fail in the negotiation with ourselves and therefore others and the world at large. And this is what transpires throughout history. And this is what we're seeing as a result of the collapse of the Western world. We are left hemispherically dominated. If we know it's possible to MK Ultra ourselves through like scrolling on our phone, by showing us our subconscious all this useless information on social media, or decide to contradict ourselves in screaming from the top of our lungs that everything is a social construct, postmodernism, but yet we placate to the idea of my truth while simultaneously telling people So as a way to reach a consensus of common sense, or push our model of understanding before we have even come to understand it, then we need to acknowledge what we're doing. Once you know what your brain does, you can't unlearn knowledge. I have gotten so left locked into the bits sometimes that I miss the whole. I'm the one that hits the pedestrian because I was looking at the car passing the intersection. That's a metaphor. I've never actually done that. The master and his emissary work the master and his emissary work best together. It's not right versus left and left versus right. The left is the expansion of the right and all there is. Like a campfire, there is intrinsic value to why you go outside, feel the air in your lungs, the smell of the fire, look at it, and there is utility to be found in it, but that's not the only interaction. So oligarchs don't see our intrinsic value in our context as human beings with potential. They just see the utility to be found and think, how can I use it? Instead of allowing us to actively be/respond in the world as the active participants we are. Carl Jung sees good and evil, sees evil is necessary for good. No, it's not. We didn't need Aristotle for Socrates to be who he was. The question, it's not about the question, it's like, did we need that? It's Aristotle was, Socrates was. It's not about utility. It just is. Thinking in terms of necessity is where our left hemisphere can go wrong. It's like, I'm not going to say we need a left and we need a right. We have them, period. Now it's up to us how we want to demonstrate ourselves in that. It's like we're swimming in the body of water. We're in the thing. Now we try to navigate best with how we can navigate, and since we can navigate with our right hemisphere, I feel like we need to start pinging to that more. I often ask the question, which is like, how did Russia and China, ancient civilizations that have lasted far longer than the West, have the ability to continue their civilizations over the span of time? And I think they chose to keep an open receptiveness to that which they did not know. They imitated the US, a country that by no means had any of the context they had, but they saw potential, and through their right hemisphere empathic intersubjectivity, changing their biases, they had that open receptiveness to renegotiating the rules. It's an open system. The oligarchs assume everyone thinks the way I do. They want control, and so it's highly competitive in nature, and that's just another kind of mode of attention. But as we've seen, it's incomplete. The oligarchs is literally a closed global perspective in the sense that it's a closed system. They're monitoring that which they set up to fail. They go in with a bias to find that which they already expect to find. We have a saying in my household, which is show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. The oligarchs have an incentive. They are trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Oligarchs create the closed environment, 15-minute cities, right? A complete control on censorship. Things are easier to control when they're known. They lack adaptability. You make the people or world adapt to you, not you adapt/negotiate with the people. Then it's not common sense, it's tyranny. I think that we are gravitated to community, the right hemisphere sees, hence why I think their model is incomplete, because the right sees the community as a means to succeed and the left sees it as a means to an end. Narrative can unify or they can weaponize. The show has been set. If they set the myth in motion and you're not thinking why you're thinking this way, who wants you to think this way, why they want you to think this way, and how does it benefit them if I proceed to think this way, then you're in the magic trick, and left will confabulate the answers to all those questions and stay in your left hemisphere drive for certainty and reducing things so as to use them. If it can, it will find the myths that give meaning to its life so as to systematize and formalize life. Whereas the right would see that the purpose in playing the game is not to win, but the purpose is found in playing the game. The point is that all of this on the micro, what's going on in your head is playing in society on the larger scale. And could you imagine what we could do if we knew this? We could literally hyper accelerate our evolution towards cooperation rather than follow for our craving for stasis in a world of change. The myth making is divide and conquer. It works because, as this presentation was subtitled, the brain is the great equalizer. The one thing that remains consistent through the course of history as a constant is our brains and what's going on in them and how we can better negotiate with them. It's good to know yourself to hold yourself in check. and each hemisphere has a different interpretation of these things, even in how they interpret themselves. And then my last slide is just going to be that when my family first got into the work of the hemispheres, we started to see it as the left versus right, but then it changed to the master and the emissary work best together. Because having a right hemisphere all by itself, even though it can use the tools of the right and it can consider the left hemisphere is a thing that, well, as my family says, you can't build a society without a tape measure. And what that means is that you do need to come in with some sort of like a conspiracy theory. Well, you chose to plan ahead to the future because you wanted to manipulate it for your own incentive. Manipulation, right? It has a very negative connotation to it, but in the sense that you're wanting to do it for which specific mode of attention and how you want to go about it. Well, that right there is a difference. So you can have I think that the thing for me that I resonate that I think of a lot is the fact that you can have your American dream, but it's in context to others, not just you. You don't know how you got to the concept of an American dream without first the physical sacrifice behind it. It's like my mom always says, you don't know what you don't know. And that goes with generations. If the knowledge isn't passed, then we can forget, and forgetting is losing context. And what is the hemisphere that helps us to keep memory? It's context over time. And so we've gotten to a point where we're fragmented because the context isn't being passed over. If people don't know how the dream came about, they can't maintain it because they never knew what it was like to earn it. They just know how to represent it as a static image. So, yeah, that's my presentation. I can stop sharing now.
Thank you, Maycee. No, that was good. I think that you've introduced a lot of concepts, and the fuels for conversation are very well set. So, with that, as I mentioned earlier, for those who'd like to throw a thought out, share an idea, or pose a question, please pop your name in the chat box like usual, or inversely, pop your little digital hand up, and I'll call upon you accordingly. The first person that I saw who got in there, I don't know if he's still here, was Paul. Paul Gettle. Paul, are you
Yeah,
still there?
yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
So I just asked if these were, well, thank you very much for the presentation. That was a bit overdrive. I think I'm gonna have to listen to the tape recorded version in slow motion, not at fast speed, to help digest all that. But one of the things that came up in my mind was, do other species demonstrate these differences, this lateralization in the brain? And I looked in ChatGPT in the meantime, and it says yes, they do. So I would ask you, have you ever looked into that, or you have any thoughts on is there anything interesting there, implications in what you're interested in this
Mhm.
subject?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, it's in his book as well. Actually, he does present that the differences, some of the statements that I made in my presentation as well are actually because of the fact that like some primates do exactly the thing that is described, in the sense where it's like my analogy with the bird to peck the seed and grab the I guess be responsible for what is like the flight or flock to which it roams. It's like that actually came from the fact that birds with their I believe their I have to always do the contralateral thing. So if it's my right hemisphere, it's my left side. So with their left eye, they'll be looking up open for the surroundings, but with their right eye, relying on their left hemisphere, they actually look down at the ground and try and peck a seed out of a specific maybe thing of pebbles, right, to differentiate. So that was where the analogy came from. But yeah, and then also there was, I believe it's in the book somewhere, where the frontal lobes are like 35% larger in us as compared to maybe dogs, which I believe might have been like 15 or 7% larger. So there are animals that have the I guess same things that we do, but it's just more developed in us. So yeah.
Cool. You got a follow up, Paul, or are you good with that?
Yeah, I'm good. It's just a wide open subject.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Richard has a few questions. Pick two, Richard.
Well, it's an amazing presentation and just so much. My mind is just reeling. Um, okay, one thing
Sorry.
is I notice with people that they can be very right brain and open to new information. They can be geniuses, but when you come to something controversial, then suddenly they shut down and they're totally left brain. So that's one question, if you could say anything about that. The other one is, uh, let's say, the educational system. I mean, are there things which encourage the development of both hemispheres operating well? And are there modes of education which kind of push you into the left brain modality? So the role of education and propaganda in sort of shaping the lateralness of the population. And I'll throw in one last little thing is, I mean, do you see the mind as being entirely material?
Hmm. Hmm. The mind is being totally material. Well, kind of like how I was alluding to in the beginning is that I don't necessarily want to come forward with an idea of what I think matter is, but I do think that it does a thing that manifests. And so like I said, I can't really project whether or not there's intentionality behind that or not, but because I feel like that would be maybe perhaps a projection, because in Ian's work, he kind of talked about the fact that it's like, as I was saying, the mode of attention to which you choose to look at something can shape and determine what you find. So even if I decide to compare a, I guess, a man to a wolf, not only am I kind of putting wolf-like qualities on the man, but now I haven't automatically put more human-like qualities on the wolf. So I feel like I will be, if I was to answer that question of like the brain in that sense, I feel like it would be maybe my brain projecting onto itself my human experience and personifying, which in some case I think that that's something that we inevitably and instinctively do, you know what I mean? But so to go on to the sorry, was your second question relating to how propaganda and the education system can kind of okay. So I think that it was funny, I was talking about this actually with my dad this morning, and when you have, because I was asking my dad this question, I was like, why is it that children who are growing up, actually, this would require some context. So, first, when you're developing, when you come and you're like a baby, maybe in your toddlerish reigns, your right hemisphere is actually developing first. And then during your teen years, that's when your left hemisphere starts to develop. And so it's very funny, actually, because you know how like your social 10-year-old that would have been, that was really nice and like I guess that open receptiveness and that right hemispheric, like inquisitive and just so super social. It just shifts in the teen years to just self-centered, focused on me, you know? And so, and that's actually because your left hemisphere is in the prime of its development during that time. And then afterwards, when you reach about 20, that's when it can start to go towards the development of your right hemisphere. And then it's funny because at 20, when I was mentioning gut feeling and the ability to, I guess, have social empathy and then all these things, that can help, I guess, in transpiring to the bigger you to look beyond yourself because you're looking at the other now. And so that I think plays a part in color revolutions, especially near that age range, because you're getting to a point where you're like, oh my gosh, like I care about the world and I want to have some sort of impact and meaning and all of these things, right? But you don't have enough lived experience and context. So you're still working on a lot of left hemisphere theoreticals about how the world works instead of actually the lived world to draw from. So I think that that's how that propagates there. And then I think for, I guess, the education, when they come out, like me and my family, we kind of always make this point, which is like, from the time you're 5 to maybe 25, if you're attending post-secondary, the system, quote unquote, has you for your entire frontal lobe development. They have you for the whole time. So that's a very concerning thing to me, because I definitely do think that propaganda, as I was mentioning, in those false myths, it's like you're if you're put in a constant state of fear and you're looking for certainty, and you're looking, well, your left hemisphere is looking for that certainty, and then the oligarchs come in and they're like, here, this is what it is, then you're like gonna instantly take it because you're already hyper accelerated in the survival mentality. And so I think that that's how propaganda can play into those narratives. And then if I my last, I guess, remark on this, in terms of um education, is that when you're in public school, and actually this is the reason why I was in public school, but the reason I like online school was because I got to be with my family more. Like, I was at home and I got to be with my sister. And I think the reason I don't like public school anymore, like whatsoever, is because what they teach you is actually very incomplete, but also because what you have now is you have a youngling being raised by a bunch of younglings. So it's the blind leading the blind. It's like, you don't these kids don't know much about the world any more than you do, and you're going into these group selections of trying to differentiate yourself and see where it is that you fit, because you're getting pushed away in different directions. And then this already like forms this categorization, whereas when I'm with my family, like me personally, there wasn't this feeling, there's never the sensation that you feel like you're not secure, like the insecurity of I need to find where I belong. Well, with my family, I never felt like I wasn't secure, you know what I mean? Because I did have something that I belonged to. And so I think that when there is that differentiation of I need to go and find where my place is, to like my dad is stronger than your dad, right? On the playground, it's like, well, what happens if you actually saw your dad and his dad working together? Then there's something else, right? So I think sorry if that's really long-winded, but but yeah.
Thank you.
All right, cool. The next person I've seen whose hand got up was Sue. Sue, are you there? There you are. You're on mute. Everyone's on mute by default. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Maycee. It's an incredible presentation. So it brought me back, and I've been doing a lot of unraveling. Starting 30 years ago, we were a part of different spiritual groups, from Buddhism to Sufism to post-Jungian, integral theory, Ken Wilber, and closing the door on each of those, finding the lacking in it. It was not context based. It didn't bring in the historical perspective. It had beautiful music and poetry, but then it didn't have the astronomy and, all the things that we got through with Rising Tide Foundation. But I did, ironically, a lot of the people who are searching, seeking, they will say we're way too left-brained. And yet, as you pointed out, the left brain deals with the abstract, it categorizes, it deals in generalities. It fundamentally looks for certainty. And so these oligarchs that are creating the kind of gurus or spiritual communities, that's actually where they're coming from. Ken Wilber wrote a book, The Theory of Everything. And when I dove into it for a couple of years, and then I went, oh my gosh, this is all generalities. This is all categorizations. And he talks about the theory of everything, and yet he doesn't talk about electromagnetic fields or the need for energy, energy density flux. He doesn't talk about any of that, or the very specific historical understanding that would help us situate ourselves where we are, how we came to be here, why we're here. Yeah. So my question is, I guess I
agree with like everything you just said, by the way.
And so, but it still came as a shock to me when people during COVID who were seeking, but I was still locked into some belief that they were seeking truth, a higher level truth, and would not fall prey to the propaganda and narratives that were pushed during COVID. But but they fell so hard. It was shocking. So I'm wondering if you have anything else to add about, how these narratives and these rituals, I mean, even putting on the mask and washing their hands over and over again, locks one into a left-hand drive. It makes so much sense that the limbic system locks into the left-hand drive, but also they were coming out with such self-contradictory, absurd statements. I kept thinking, oh, well, this will wake people up. And it might have even been McGilchrist who said, the more contradictory, the more absurd, the more people will almost buy into it in a religious kind of fervor way. Does that?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I agree with like everything that you just said. Oh my gosh, that was such good pattern recognition. Okay, so that was a lot. I think that you're dead on when it comes to the ritualistic aspects of these narratives. Like when we're talking a lot about the I guess occults, and honestly, when it comes to any modality of mentality where you're trying to formalize things, right, in existence, that's where I think your rituals come from. Is like, if I do this, this, and this, it guarantees this, right? It's like A plus B equals C, or at least it should, right? And then when it doesn't, the left hemisphere isn't like, oh, well, I wonder why that was. I'll just do the same thing. Like, I'll just change my point of view. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. No, it's like double down, do it again. It's like, it didn't work, do it again. But I think that the reason why the oligarchs keep with what they're keeping in terms of their tactics of the divide and conquer strategy is because it works. Like, why fix what ain't broke? You know what I mean? And I think, to me, I feel like they actually know this knowledge that I just presented about ourselves, is that it's like through the psychological manipulation. I think they just understand that there's a part of us that gets dogmatic. And like, all of this is instinctive and intuitive because we all have brains, right? So it's like, you didn't need me to tell you this in order for you to sue. You just came up with all these amazing pattern recognitions because you have a mind. Like you live the thing. What better person qualified to say that they understand than the thing that lives it, right? It's like, I was telling my sister that that the thing that bothered me sometimes with the transgenders and like men that come up who are pretending to be women, I was like, you've not lived the thing. You don't know what it's like physically. I was like, come back to me when you bleed every like month. But but sorry, that was a total tangent. But going off on like the ritualistic thing, I think that that's definitely the case, is that, and I think that that was playing into my idea of the American dream concept, of why I brought that in at the end, because I was like, what you have is you formalize life. You need to get a job, get married, make lots of money for your kids, right? Retire, bada bing, bada boom, bada bam. No problem with that. Actually, like, again, incomplete does not mean that there isn't something to be garnered. But so it's like, I would do the same thing, but it's very formalized in the sense that you don't know how you earn that, right? What did Benjamin Franklin have to go to? The limits he had to go to in terms of building up a society's minds first. Why did he do that? He had to build up their intellectual caliber, in order for them to get thinking about these things, in order for them to express the values in the physical world, as kind of was demonstrated in my presentation. And then you can start getting shit done, kind of thing. But then that's what helps you maintain it. The right hemisphere keeps in context, time, and memory, in the sense that it's like, well, it might not always be like this. So we need to try and maybe account for what might happen as a potentiality of risk in the future, right? Whereas the left hemisphere is like, there's no risk. It's going to work. Like, right? Like, there's no way it won't work, right? But it's like, oh, there's always a way. It might not work. But so sorry if that totally went a bit away from what you were saying, but I definitely would be inclined to agree that it's like my something that I always, I guess, because you were describing your journey in terms of how you kind of went from different sectors because they weren't like, it was incomplete models kind of thing. I would say that's I'd say it's the same reason why Gilchrist had a hard time writing his book. He had a hard time putting it into a static thing, piece of paper, that could be put out into the lived physical world, which is very helpful. Hence why right and left work together. He without his left hemisphere, he couldn't have written the book, right? He had to focus in. He had to get very specific, make the sentences right. But you need the right hemisphere for the pragmatics of understanding where he was going to go in the contextual whole moving forward, right? But it's like he wouldn't be able to do this thing without his left hemisphere. But it's like he said that the struggle in it, obviously, though, is that you're trying. It's making the explicit implicit, and that's why I said the beautiful part is like is the fact that it's you're the living thing. It's my dad always says that when he was doing his I guess Bible thumping back in the day was that the lived word is only lived because you're the thing that's living. Like you're the lived word, you're the thing that makes it living, and so you're the thing that makes it alive. And so I think that that's why I'm very excited for this group of people and whoever decides to pursue this knowledge to take it further, because I think that that's what Gilchrist would want, and has actually explicitly stated that that's what he's looking for. So, but yeah, so I think that that's the problem is that rituals and then a Bible and then or insert texts here. There's no problem with these texts. What like I mean, there could be in terms of their intention, right? And that needs to be considered. But all of them was still based on someone doing a real physical thing, right? It's like, okay, you're gonna write about Jesus Christ and the amazing things that he did. It's like, well, he physically did that, and then somebody looked at that and was like, oh my gosh, and I want to share that, and so they had to condense it in terms of well, what. And so they're like, okay, I gotta write this down. I gotta go give it to people, and so that way they can be like, ooh, I should do that too, right? And it's it's that sequential step formula, but you're not asking the question of like, well, like hold on, like there was a lot of like physical lived world experience that went into that, and so it's not just let me replicate it. It's like yes and no. How do you replicate it? How do you, as in you personally? Because like I'm gonna tell you what, I ain't walking on water, but I can put on a presentation for Rising Tide Foundation. You know what I mean? But yeah, so
Thank you, Maycee. So beautifully said. And just to finish up, I think we read Master and His Emissary when it first came out, so 15 years ago. But closing the door on a lot of things, you know, I think we closed the door on McGilchrist, and it's such a beautiful thing to bring that back in. Last week it was Persian classical music. We closed the door on Persian classical music, and it's just, oh no, like there's so much beauty, and that's what draws us, you know, and the
yeah,
goodness, the truth, and yeah.
an open receptiveness.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, the oligarchy, I was thinking as far as their formula for disintegration of society that they've been maintaining should really be if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Sorry, if it if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So there's this commitment to a way, a certain static formula that they're just so committed to, but the point of the formula is to break us from our natural maturation as a species, as individuals. And I think that there's a lot you've given right now in the course of this presentation, these discussions to give people a sense of how to undo some of that damage that's been put into our system. And the other thing I would just say too is I've met a lot of people, and that one of the things that originally, because I'd heard of McGilchrist over the years, and one of the things that turned me off is that the people who often would promote McGilchrist and who were using it were often themselves in their own heads too much. They weren't part of a group dynamic. And so they were overly fixed and rigid in pointing out, oh, that's left, that's right. And there was like this formulaic approach to everything. But the difference that Cynthia and I noticed in getting to know your family is that you guys, as a family culture, as a dynamic, were working together and putting it more into a lived process where it's not like every individual going into an island state and going purely inward and thus developing over atrophied ironically left hemispheric proclivities and trying to map out something which is creative, but you're doing it, you're trying new things. So I think that that's an important part of this dynamic as far as testing it out. You can't just read solo. That's just something I want to share. But I don't know if you want to comment on that, or if
I'll make it short because I know there's a lot of things, but I would just say that it's also because I think the left hemisphere with maybe like the openness guise of the right hemisphere in terms of wanting to do something good would be like, we should write that down. But I feel like what you just alluded to is that the right hemisphere would be like, write it down. Why write it down? I can just live it. You know what I mean? So that was just like my one little comment on that. But
Mhm. All right. Jerry. I saw Jerry in there early on. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. Thanks, Matt. And thanks, Maycee. I think I'm like Paul. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch this presentation, but in slow motion. You've given us so much to think about. But I wanted to thank you for, because I've been reading a lot of what other people think on this right hemisphere, left hemisphere. For me, I couldn't quite get it. But when you were describing it in terms of horizontal and vertical, I don't know what it is. It just clicked in my head, and oh, that makes sense now. Sort of like the right hemisphere, and we experience, but then we have to transfer it to our left hemisphere vertically, where we kind of abstract it, but then we can't leave it there. We can't go rogue. We have to transfer it back to the right hemisphere, to our experience, and make sense of it all. So anyway, with the horizontal vertical, it started making sense to me. So I wanted to thank you for that. But I'm thinking of it from the standpoint that it seems a healthy person who has a healthy mental life has this harmony between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And people who don't have that harmony, start having these problems. And I think the oligarchy knows this in a rough, crude way and tries to take advantage of it and to disrupt this harmony we have naturally between our two hemispheres. And I know one of the things I wrote down you were talking about was this fear of uncertainty. They use that to try to disrupt our harmony. And something I've been thinking about for a while is that people who have a certain confidence in their own mind are able to handle this fear of uncertainty. But people who don't have this confidence are susceptible to all kinds of, manipulations. And it's it's like people who don't have a confidence in themselves, they just react to the world. They don't actually experience this healthy interaction of our right and left hemispheres. And it's like people who do have a confidence are actually able to decide or determine which way they want to go, which brings up this whole idea of free will. So I was just wondering, does Dr. Gilchrist discuss this idea of free will in terms of, the right and left hemisphere? Or maybe you have your own comment you'd like to make on that. That's just, I'm curious about.
yeah, he definitely goes into that into his work. So I won't spoil too much for you. Haha. But he kind of goes into the concept actually as like a free won't. So and that definitely your face that you just made was me when I first read that. But in that concept though, it's more like we kind of understand things sometimes in what it is that they're not. So it's almost like there was a song once where it was like, I sure don't know what love is, but I sure know what it's not, right? And then in the idea of the concept of free won't, it's almost like it's more like you're choosing to, I guess, not do something instead of necessarily like you're willfully doing something. It's almost like, again, it plays into that concept of like, are you going to do the no or the absence of no, right? And so he does play around with that concept, and he even plays around with it in terms of the unconscious and consciousness realm. So if you guys are like definitely interested in that, then he definitely tries to play with that. Because he mentioned that the unconscious realm sometimes well, first of all, he says don't differentiate the unconscious as if it's not you, in the sense that your consciousness and what you consciously choose and what you perceive and all that. He said that's a more I mean, like he never Yeah, he says that it's more of a left hemispheric modality because it's more explicit, whereas the unconscious is less explicit. So you're more apt to not really, I guess, regard it as having its own wills, its own intents, its own, right? Because, well, you weren't aware of it consciously, right? But then he talks about that in the sense that I believe before we um I guess do an action of some sort. I could be wrong on this. So forgive me, but I believe that it's a delay maybe by like a fragment of a second, but it's your unconscious first that is kind of acting upon your consciousness. And I feel like that would intuitively make sense where it's like there's hence the instinct, and hence I was like saying that the right hemisphere is very much in tune with instinct in the body. And so but yeah, so if the answer is yes, he definitely does touch on it.
Virgil, you still there? You are, Virgil.
Yeah, hi. Lots of things to touch upon. Great presentation. There was a lot of really good information for me personally. In particular, what I really appreciate is this kind of emphasis. I want to say it's implicit, but I do feel like you're getting at this pretty consciously, which is Jerry just touched upon it, and Matt before that as well, which is the concept of agency. I've been thinking about that's what I call it, that's my term for free will, so to speak. That's something I've been thinking about a lot because the more I kept trying to decipher the puzzle of the world that we live in, so to speak, in especially in recent years. But it's been a lifelong journey. The more I started realizing that that is exactly what is being dismantled, or at the very least, it's very close to the core of what seems to be dismantled by the oligarchy. Let's say it's this sense of agency, this ability to recognize our own the part that we play in the world around us. And, as Matt and Cynthia like to say, I saw this one T-shirt on Rising Tide Foundation website. You are history. I think it says something like that. Like we are history. That gets at this problem of agency that is really it's kind of an overdrive. The rate at which it's being dismantled right now, I believe, in the bigger picture. And that is kind of the concept or the context for my question, which is, do you know or do you have any thoughts about how kind of passive interaction with information or media, whichever term you prefer, such as scrolling through social media, taking in kind of the useless information that you mentioned in your presentation, or which one example that I often think of is like how a lot of people watch TV, for example, because that was around for decades before the advent of 21st century digital media, let's say. Um, so do you think how, or do you have any thoughts about how that passive interaction with information and media uh, plays into what you also call like left locking, let's say? How do you think, do you have any thoughts about how that plays into the left-right hemispheres on a massive scale? Because I personally relate it to, I mean, many problems. I'm sure you agree that, especially in the West, we're facing kind of on a collective level now. But cognitive stagnation, if not just straight up decline, is one of those things that I see as a result of that personally. And so, yeah, how do you relate that, perhaps in more technical terms or more pedantic terms, if you will, to the left-right hemispheres?
That is a really good question. Um, I think that I mentioned that the sustained attention is something that the right hemisphere is in tune with, and I mentioned that in the sense of memory, because I think that when you can sustain your attention over time and space, that is memory. I feel like when you're not able to, I guess, remember something, it's because you're not, it's not in, I guess you're not able to hold all the multiple aspects of it together. And so when I think of the fragmentation of like social media or scrolling or all these fun things, fun, I think that it's shortening your attention span. And I think that that's shortening your ability to hold memory and then therefore your ability to hold context. And I think that that's how that's playing into the lived world is that because so often, like I was mentioning in my presentation, it's like the knowledge isn't passed down kind of thing. I hear a lot of people say that it's like I don't I wasn't taught this. You know what I mean? It's like I grew up this way. I wasn't taught this type of thing. It's like I don't really know how to change a car engine by the time I'm 5. I don't know how to do that. I'm just using that as an example. But what I mean is that like all of these things like skills through as I was mentioning before, like the right hemisphere's ability for empathic imitation. It's like that skills are, I guess, very fundamental, I guess, in the context of the real world of experience. And so I think that when they take away our ability to understand like actually like how things work through our interaction with them, then that's how they manipulate us as well. And I think that that's why we're going more towards this virtual aspect of reality, where it's like virtual reality and all of these things, which are just they're just abstractions in your head. They're not actually real things, and then you're not engaging with the real world. And then the question is like who doesn't want you engaging with the real world? Like why are you doing this thing? And so I think that like I said, it's the shortening of the attention span that definitely takes away our ability to hold context together. And I think that it plays into the idea that if you can't take in context and you can't be I guess aware of the patterns, then yeah, like you're not going to be able to do anything about it. Then it's just the mind searching for to fill in blanks, and then someone will come in and they will fill that, or they will have you fill that, right? More that's more likely the case. They will have you fill in your own blanks. And it's almost like my dad described it in the sense where there was an engineer on the rig and they were trying to piece together how they could properly build this assemble for the rigs for it to best go well. And then dad came in and he was just like, okay, so this is nice theory and all, but based on me physically knowing how it works, I think that we could probably tweak it and then it would be better, right? And so I think that that's the ping with the hemispheres is like it's a real time ping in your demonstration in your head and it plays out, right? And so but yeah, so I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
No, that absolutely answers my question. I related personally, just as a little follow-up to well, the way I interpret it from your presentation, because I was aware of the left-right hemispheres before, but this really is now fleshing it out for me. It's almost like, to kind of oversimplify it and maybe summarize it, I kind of see now, at least in my current perspective, the left hemisphere is kind of being in terms of just fundamental perspective in the kind of the most abstract, broad sense, as the part of your brain or your mind that zooms in, whereas the right hemisphere is what allows you to zoom out, right? And then the concept of Gestalt comes in as well. So I think yeah, what you're saying, right? Like there's more. I don't know. I think there's also more. There's like a lot more probably that's going on beyond attention span because I've been noticing this lately. Like I thought it was mainly attention span, but it's also something else that is being cultivated in a lot of people. I spend in it too much time, very little time, but still too much time on X spaces, and there's just this like it. I realized recently, it's not even that people only have short attention spans is that there's like a genuine unwillingness to even really listen to the other person. Which I don't know how that relates, but yeah, Great presentation. Lots of thoughts.
Yeah, small comment on that is that like, you see that in reality for sure. It's like I remember
Yeah.
there was someone in my household that literally said, I don't eat toast, and they completely denied it. And then they literally went to the kitchen and ate some toast, and I'm like, okay. So I was like, oh my
What?
God, like it's real time hemisphere is playing out like right in front of me. Cause like it's funny because we'll use metaphors sometimes of like, what are you mentally ill or like are you retarded? Right. It's like I feel like we're actually doing that for a reason
Yeah,
when
yeah.
someone's going down that path. And but no, I agree. There is this willful blindness for sure. And I think that as my presentation kind of alluded to, I think that it's because of the has to the left hemisphere is like absolute dogmatic needs to be certain. And because it's not even necessarily because let's like not necessarily always attribute negative connotations to that, right? Because like as I said, like it's still necessary in a lot of what we're doing. I wouldn't be able to, I guess, have my conversation with you if I didn't have that ability to try and reduce some things. But um, I think that it plays into the fact that it's like there's this absolute need for certainty, and I think that when we get as we were talking about with Sue with those ideas of or sorry um Richard with those ideas of like, oh, we need to like belong in a group, and there's this like dogmatic needing to differentiate and categorize yourself. If you're doing that with yourself, you're doing that with others, and then it transpires on the larger network. I think the biggest thing that I feel like the takeaway is that on the micro, it is on the macro 100%. But yeah.
Completely agree. Thank you.
Right, next up, somebody in my living room, RTF team has asked a question. Go ahead.
Do we have mic? Do you hear us?
Yeah, you can turn on the video if you want. Yeah. Hey, Nick.
Hi,
Right.
Maycee. Hi, thanks for the lovely class. It was awesome. Just a lot of great information, sparked a lot of ideas. So I had a couple of things, because we spoke a lot about right and left, and as we're listening, like it feels divisive in and of itself. So what does McGilchrist talk about the agape concept or the Holy Spirit concept, which is when instead of you as a individual feel like you're cornered and have to make a choice between right or left, you can save that division from happening by letting the spirit govern over the right and left and not actually having to feel like you pick one or the other because they can't access truth. And so it's only, for me, epiphany is when you have the unit of right and left, and that resonance takes us to a higher elevation, rising tide lifts all boats, these metaphors, and allows us to access the divine. So I just wonder what McGilchrist talks about. What is his idea of the role of intervention and the agape concept, which is the provider of the higher hypothesis, and will actually save us from that internal divisiveness or that internal division that actually then divides us with everybody else.
Hmm.
And for
I
me, just to add something more, like
Mhm.
as an artist, like esteem doesn't actually mean confidence. It means when one has accepted that they, right or left, cannot know truth and allow the spirit to actually govern um, the navigation, allow the spirit, and it might seem unreasonable at first, but with that, there's more chance of actually discovering truth than using didactic or sensual means, which are often very painful too if we just use sense or form. And Schiller did say he'd rather sense because you're probably more likely to stumble upon truth, but you will hurt yourself in doing so. And I agree. But what he talks about is that you don't have to choose. You can unify and elevate your mind to a higher place if you allow the spirit to govern rather than you thinking that you just have these two things that you have to pick between, which is what we have in political systems too. So yeah, just I put that
Hmm.
across to you.
Um, I think that it's the dance between that is the uh agapic in that sense. I think that it's not that you necessarily have to choose right or left. I think that regardless, they're going to be they have, I guess, modes of being, but I think that it's more so, it's almost like in my presentation how I said, like when you go in a kitchen and you're standing in the kitchen, you're kind of automatically, you just start, I don't know, you think about food. I just know I do. And so you're thinking, okay, I'm standing in the kitchen and I'm thinking about food. Like in the environment that you've surrounded yourself with, a thing is happening, right? And so I think that if you're aware of the facts that when you go and stand in the kitchen that you're going to start thinking about food, you might be better apt to be like, maybe I don't need to go and eat something right now because maybe I'm not that hungry and maybe it's right. And so I think that when you're in the environment of the world, you kind of have no choice but using your brain, and the hemispheres are doing a thing. And depending on the environment, sometimes it's better to lean more towards that of the right than the left. But the thing is that they're not separate in what we do. Like he touches on the fact that it's like in almost everything that you do, both your hemispheres are involved in what's going on. Like that's an inevitable complete emphatic yes. It's just sometimes on the larger scale of what happens is we can lean more towards, I guess, a utilization bias in the sense of like we can be lean more towards the left and maybe a little bit more towards the right. But I think that it's more so because we're not aware of that. And I think that if we were aware of that, we would be able to do the proper dance between the two, as we were alluding. I think it was Virgil or Gerald. I'm sorry, but one of you was mentioning that it's like it's that proper hanging between the two. And I think that that in betweenness of when they're doing that thing, of when that happens, that's it. Like that's the Gestalt to me. I think it's the process of the because even the based on his what is it, his book, he talked about the neurons and how they communicate. And it's not that like one pings to the other like an assembly line. That's not how it works. I almost see it more so as like kind of like a swirl where it like overlaps on each other and there's parallel processing that happens, right? So I don't think that it's one or the other. And I definitely agree that like for sure when I came in I was like, well, that's kind of like sounds divisive. But I think that if we though take the time to choose, that's like, oh, we're standing in the kitchen, we're thinking about food. Do we need to be thinking about this thing, right? I think that, oh, we're I guess looking at it this way. Do we need to be looking at it this way? I am going to start leaning towards leaning about it this way. So maybe I can try and shift what that is. And so it's almost like you are swimming in the water. There's no getting out of the fact that you're in this thing. But you can, I guess, as in your analogy, it's like you can choose to go and drown the person next to you, or I guess you can do that rising tides float all ships kind of concept where it's like, well, how do we like help each other up in what it is that we're already inevitably in? It's like we're in a thing, we exist in the world. And so that's more so the howness of how you do that, I think, is where the dance comes and where the beauty between comes. But yeah.
Thank you. Juan has a question too.
Quan, you got to get a little bit closer though, just because the mic's not so good on that computer.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so hi Maycee, I'm really impressed by your presentation, and I have to say that I'm a little bit excited too because we share some vocabulary, because I also talk about vertical reality and horizontal dimensions. And I would say that when you present the left and the right hemisphere, for me, it's a very interesting way to present how the facts and the myths are related by hermeneutics, okay? Because for me, hermeneutics is precisely that capacity to give a meaning to the human life. And when you're speaking of the left hemisphere, that is more concerning the creation of a storytelling or myth. That's one dimension of the left hemisphere. But the left hemisphere is also involved in the investigations of the fact, because the concepts used in sciences and so on are also derived from the words and the concept of the left hemisphere. So, and the idea of the union of the two that would give rise to that unity of awareness, if you want, okay? I think that is precisely the metaphor that you use, that you mentioned, and probably is from Gilchrist, that the left hemisphere would give you meteorological data, and the right hemisphere is a window opening into reality. And that higher awareness that would bring us to the higher timeless form of beauty, goodness, and truth would not come from the storytelling or the investigation into the facts, but from the union of those two, giving meaning to human life, hermeneutics, that would bring to the theory of knowledge precisely, okay, to that overarching awareness, because I use theory here in the Greek meaning, contemplation, theory of knowledge or contemplation of that awareness uniting those two dimensions of facts and myths. And that metaphor of the window into reality is precisely that, okay? The union of the two that would open that window, and that window to those timeless form of beauty, goodness, and truth. And thus McGilchrist addressed that dimension of the higher form of beauty, goodness, and truth.
Can you was there a question at the end of that? Because I didn't hear the last sentence you said.
Oh, he just asked, does McGilchrist address the this idea of the union between beauty, goodness, and truth? And he was going through the theory of knowledge, meaning hermeneutics, as a union of the world of facts and myth. So a theory of higher knowledge that can go beyond either realm. And yeah, it does. And Quan, if I'm missing anything in that very briefest of summaries, I know I'm not doing justice, but is there anything else you would add to that to make it clear what the question was?
No, that you understood perfectly my question, because my question is precisely, I think that the presentation by Maycee on McGilchrist is perfect for the hermeneutical dimension, meaning how to make the embodiment precisely between myth and facts. But does McGilchrist address the question of the timeless form of beauty, goodness, and truth in neurobiological explanation?
Beauty, goodness, and truth. Interesting. Okay, so I don't know. I think that when it comes to the idea of what Gilchrist is presenting in his works, I think that he kind of goes on to share what it is that neuroscience can tell us about philosophy, but also what philosophy can tell us about neuroscience. And then he tries to go into the reciprocal relationship of what it is that they both bring about in one another. I think that when you're owing down the idea of the left and right hemisphere almost on like a vertical or horizontal axis, or trying to coincide the ideas of beauty, goodness, and truth with I guess that higher state of the unification of fact and myth. I think that those concepts and those ideas are, I guess, practiced in the way in which our hemispheres interact with each other. If that makes sense. I think that when we are searching for truth, I don't think that because I'm trying to, basically what I'm saying is that we could get caught in the I guess dissecting of that concept, or we could be asking ourselves why we're dissecting that concept, and more so like what part of us is the one that would be trying to ask that. And I don't mean like which, is it this one or is it that one, but I mean more so the fact that what we're doing in our metaphors that are grounded in the lived world of experience, what it is that we come to, I guess, choose as those metaphors is still in playing to a part of us that is wanting to find truth as certainty or completeness, and one that is seeing it as process. And so that's why I sometimes come back to mode of attention, to those specific types of concepts, is trying to understand where am I coming from? And then to understand where am I coming from, it's, well, how can I get there? And I think that that's why when I was pointing out in the beginning of my presentation, in the sense that it's like you come to this articulation and formulation of what these things are, mediated through your mind and your body. And so does Gilchrist touch on truth, beauty, and goodness in that sense? I think he comes to touch on it as to how we come to touch on that, and in what different ways. And obviously it's still static because, again, like I was mentioning, it's in a physical book, right? And so it's still this sort of left hemispheric reductionistic of what Gilchrist's work was, because it was predicated on a lot of real life experience, in the sense of like had to study these subjects, had to go and do the thing. But I think so it can be, I guess, he puts it forward, puts in his thing. We put down our analysis of horizontal or vertical axis. This is what we're doing this thing. But I still think that it's still down to like, well, why are we doing this thing, right? And then the motivation behind that. And I think that that's why I'm having a hard time trying to touch on whether or not he coincides. I think that will be revealed if you, I guess, read the work. But yeah.
Quan, I see you moving your lips, but you have to unmute. No, yeah, unmute. Was that okay, or?
Yes, I'm on mute now, I think.
Okay.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to say to Maycee that I'm very impressed by her presentation, and I'm very impressed by her answer to my question, because I read McGilchrist's book and the answer to my question is not obvious in McGilchrist's book, and I think that your explanation is quite awesome. And I was absolutely delighted that you used the word reductionist when you were speaking of the left hemisphere.
All right. That was a challenging question. You navigated that. Okay, so actually, on that note here, I'll throw on, since on that line of thought, just a quick question on the sort of the 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 left hemisphere, right hemisphere idea of the negation, because you were saying that when we pass a judgment of yes, it's more like yes, we found it, I've judged, yes, this is it. It's actually more, and you've said this a few times in your presentation, a negation of no, more than it being a positive assertion of a positive yes when dealing with uh the idea yes versus no, and the boundary condition separating the thing that allows for boundary conditions to exist in the first place. And I was just wondering, like I know you've been looking through the Science Unshackled book and Kepler's works, and so I was just thinking about how a lot of models trying to explain the right answer for the structure of the solar system in Kepler's time, there was a ton of efforts, and they were all like equally wrong. They were all kind of like over formalizing things without examining what they didn't know. So passing judgments prematurely, left hemispheric dominant stuff. But then, Kepler at a certain point, after working through a lot of these things, these different hypotheses of which model would better do the job, he discovers the harmonic idea, his harmonic eureka, and he judges it. He passes a certain judgment, and that there's like a musicality based upon the golden section, which is tempering the behavior of the planets around the sun. And we found evidence of the golden section in, that you can construct geometrically in galaxy formations, other things. So I was just wondering, would that be in McGilchrist's mind? If I were to ask McGilchrist, would he say that Kepler's like eureka, his judgment of like, aha, yes, that's the concept, as a negation of a negation, which or would he say that that's a positive discovery that's not simply a negation of a negation?
Sorry, Maddie's sitting across from me. She's like, um, I'd say that like in his work, he kind of does touch on the idea of aha moments, and I think that to my understanding, in terms of like how I interpreted it, because like it's gonna be different for your mind, I know that for damn sure. And so that's why I'm really excited for when you read it. But I think for my interpretation of those aha moments, because of the right hemisphere's ability to have that understand the implicit, right? I think that that's what leads in some respects to aha moments, is that level of it comes to you full resolution, right? It's not like it was derived from like necessarily another piece of information, then you're like piecemealing it together and like ta-da. I think that in his book he does address scientists who do come to those moments. Right now I'm kind of drawing a blank as to how, but I do know that it is mentioned, so I will say for sure. In terms of a negation of a negation, do you mean like by understanding something by what it's not? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, like that's part of the journey, is the figuring out what it isn't. But at a certain point, we make the incision, if we're going to be making a discovery of like, okay, but it is this, after going through a lot of it is not this and it is not this is. Yeah, that's more what I was saying.
Hmm. Hmm. I think it makes me think of what was said in his work when he said that the mind has more of the characteristics of a process than a thing. And so I think that can go for a lot of discoveries as well, where even after you make the discovery, there's still more to expand upon it, right? So I think that even when it's like, aha, I've done this thing, I feel like there's still always more that could be expanded upon it. But it doesn't mean that it's not something that's in its own individual beauty for what it is. And by what it is, I mean for the process that it is. Hence why I feel like it is that gestalt in the sense of the pieces coming together. Like in the beginning of my presentation, when I said that where's the electric current? Is it in the positive terminal, the negative terminal, or is it the space between? It's like it's when the whole thing comes together, right? But then how you use that, that's a different thing, right? So like the discoveries, it's like, like how do we I guess use that or apply that, and how does that transpire in our lives? And I think that is the constant expansion right there, is when that happens. That's more, but so yes, the answer is yes, he does answer moments in that book. And then in terms of it being what it's not, I think that it just leaves room for the fact that there could be more. But
Fair enough. Good. Okay. We have time. How much time do you have? I see that there's 3 more questioners waiting in queue. Are you good for those 3, Maycee?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Richard,
Yeah.
you're on.
Thanks. I've done lots and lots of writing in my life. And it always starts because I think I understand something and I want to explain it. And I've often had the experience that when I finish the article, it's saying things that I never knew. And what you've said about left and right brain clarifies what's happening. It's like my right brain has this intention to clarify something. And then to actually construct sentences, I have to go to my left brain and come up with, facts and details. But then my right brain sees that, and that's new information. And the process of writing is changing the context I'm writing about. And I always didn't understand how that happened. I was always saying, well, it's like I'm channeling something or whatever. I didn't see it as something I was doing by a bilateral process, So what you said really, really clarifies that.
I love that. That was great. Because it's very true. And so I feel like when I go to write down things too, because sometimes I go to document it, and then I'm like, oh, okay, so this is what it is. But then I'm like, yeah, but is it? And then there's more, and I'm like, oh, okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Let me say one thing about aha moments too, because of course, there's lots of probably different ones, but I think a lot of what an aha moment is moving an understanding from one context to another. And suddenly seeing how the dynamics and relationships you see in one context, it applies here. And in that new context, it's a new insight. Whereas in the old context, it was just common knowledge.
Yes, I agree with this statement. Do we want to, since Matthew's not meeting anymore, Paul, do you want to go for it?
Okay, thank you. It's a second question. I'll try to keep it brief. I'm quite fascinated by post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic states. And do you have any, or Gilchrist have any discussion around how the interplay between the lateralization and post-traumatic stress states and how they affect each other? We would react to stress in a certain way because of our way our brains are, looking at our brains like that would indicate that we're going to act in a certain way. And the other way around, post-traumatic stress may change the way our, maybe just make us completely left-brained for a while or something like that. So that's a little bit what I'm thinking, if that makes any sense to you.
I think that he has touched on it. I think from my understanding, I feel like it would be the left hemisphere positivity bias in thinking that you understand the world around you. So I think that often some of the things that I hear, even in interviews, is the idea of people failing to understand how human beings could do such horrible things to one another. And I
Mhm.
think that that comes from you already having at least like some preconceived notion of what human beings are. And so I think that even if you make the assumption that people are trustworthy and they are good and all these things, and like for sure, I definitely think there's hence part true things can be true at the same time, right? There's part truths for sure, but I think that not considering the potentiality as well though of the fact that like but human beings could do this thing, right? It's like that's I feel like having that I guess open receptiveness using I guess implicit reason as well to understand that it's like this there is that part of us in human beings that what we call evil, right? It's like I think that that is something that can be considered when it's left hemisphere positivity bias. It's everybody thinks the way I think. So if you're a nice person and you're trustworthy, then maybe you'll think, well, everybody else is nice, everybody else is trustworthy. But it's like because there's different aspects of wholes, right? There's different aspects of things, and so I think that it accounts for it in terms of PTSD subjects and maybe where they um, find themselves is that they found themselves doing a thing which they didn't really think that they could do. And so I think that that is almost it's too nuanced really to like reduce it to either or, and I don't want to do that, but um that level of that shame and that sense of like responsibility to the fact that like oh no I did this thing, maybe it leaves you in a place where you're kind of like stuck in the past and you haven't mapped it. So I think that that's what can prohibit you from moving forward. And I've met people like that, and not PTSD, but you meet people where you clearly haven't, and by mapped I mean like you haven't um figured out where you are on the map. You've left yourself kind of in the dust and you're not taking a look at what's happening now because you're too focused on then, and then you aren't able to move forward. And I think that that could be attributed to the left hemisphere. I personally think it would. Um, and then because like I've met people where that's exactly what happens is they haven't mapped a difficult situation in their life. It was traumatic, painful, and what they do is they stay there, or what they do is they chose to enact upon it in the sense of I'm going to run away from it. But the left hemisphere not understanding that no matter where you go, there you are. Like no matter where you go, you're with you, right? That they think that problem solved, like even if it's physically moving to a new place, like I've seen that, and it's like no, it's still in your head. You still need to deal with it. So it's like you still need to acknowledge the now, the individuality that is now, because that is not what was and that is not what could be. And so yeah.
It's a difficult subject. I can understand.
Yeah, very, very challenging. All right. But yeah, that was good. That was a good way to begin to address it and think about it.
Well, it's just a lot for we have just something for me to think about, and it's
Yeah,
just a lot for everybody. I think
for
it's a
sure.
whole rabbit hole there. Thanks.
Absolutely. All right. So just to be clear, we're gonna go through Kelly, Arlen, and Sue. Those are the last three people on the list here. So I'll throw it to Kelly. Kelly.
Thanks. Hi, Maycee. Um, yeah, the real thing I wanted to, I want to know is your opinion on like where the soul fits in to all this. But before I even ask that, I have a need to know, are there any instances of like the left and the right brain like reversing? Like, some people are right-handed, some are left-handed. I hold a nail and I hammer with my left hand and I hammer with my right. It, could that happen with the brain? Is it, or like left-handed people in their, like the way their brain works? Do you know of any instances?
Yeah, actually, I didn't put it in my presentation. I probably should have. But the left hemisphere does primarily deal with like tools and that of grasping. I did mention that. But actually, funny enough, when you activate the action of like grasping something, so I'm grabbing my phone right now in my right hand, and then if I grab it in my left, it still activates my left hemisphere. Like that's just straight up the data that comes out on that. So it's like it's not necessarily that it's a reverse. It's like when I was mentioning that the right hemisphere can kind of use the tools of the left, what I mean by tools of the left is it can do what the left hemisphere can do. Sometimes, if not better than the left can do it. This is what I mean when I meant that like sometimes it's not 50-50 in terms of their roles. But yes, that is an instance where that can happen. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. But you did ask about the soul.
Yeah.
Uh
Like, what's your view on that?
it's a complicated
I'm just
question.
interested.
Um, okay. I would be okay. My idea of the soul is that I don't really think I get an idea of the soul without my brain. If I had to make it as blunt as I could, I feel like that's as simple as that would go. But it's not as simple as do I believe there is no soul? When it comes to belief, it's interesting. The concept kind of gets explored in Gilchrist as well, where it's like we can say that we believe something in the sense of I think, which is not really believing. But if I said that I believe in you, that's a different thing. I'm not saying I think about you. Like I be like, oh, I believe this to be true. I think this is true, right? It's like, no, I believe in you. That's a different thing. It's like I'm holding a certain disposition towards myself and you and the world. It's like that's a disposition I'm holding. So it's like the soul thing. I can neither disprove nor prove, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think that there isn't that it's not in stasis. It's not a static thing. The idea of what that is. I was having a conversation with my friend actually about that in terms of the concept of heaven. And I thought to myself, none of the concept of heaven that you get is without your experience in the lived world. And that doesn't necessarily just mean on Earth, but also your idea of space and just everything that you engage with. I'm like, you don't get that idea of that utopia without, I think, what you're engaging with here. And so I think that with the idea of the soul, I don't think that it's I think that both hemispheres would probably have an interpretation of what that is, one of which would probably think it's in stasis, and another which would be completely open, if not already entrenched with it. But yeah.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of people or some other people that want to talk, but because I could talk about this topic forever. The soul and, well, what happens when we die? And, our brain's not there, but our soul still exists, stuff like that.
Well, I think the point of these classes is to really get people to start getting into a process orientation, to get philosophical and chew on these incommensurables, the idea of universality and specificity, general and the part, the whole, right? And the parts of the whole, purposefulness, like all of these things are difficult concepts, and we'll never really be able to wrap a bow on in a crystallized way. But the way to sort of get closer at it is to get into these sorts of dialectical processes and just challenge ourselves to chew on the philosophical concepts, which is what the oligarchy doesn't want to do, right? They want us to be really, really hungry for right answers and go to the back of the textbook, in school to get all of those answers and not to really get into not to really like swim, right? To read about the theory of swimming, but not actually just jump in the water. So that's why I like a lot of these things, and the fact that we don't all agree or we have different ways of looking at a problem. That's really the value, is like everybody chewing on the same sort of thing that we're all yearning to solve. So it's really, I really just appreciate this so much. And as I promised, there's two more questions. There's one from Arlen, one from Sue. So Arlen, go for it. Or Cynthia, if it's Cynthia. It's always Arlen and Cynthia on the call at the same time. So I don't know which one is asking the question. You guys are on mute. Oh, they might be gone. No, I see him. I see his mouth moving. He's not even on mute.
Yeah, he's not on mute, but I can't hear him.
Okay. So we're gonna.
Okay, you said keep the ball rolling. We'll go to Sue.
Ball rolling. Yeah, exactly. Good trouble. Yeah. We all read that the same. Our right hemispheres interpreted that pattern pretty well. Okay. So Sue, follow up. Go for it.
Okay, I just wanted to go back to the question that Matt asked around, Kepler's insights into the planetary motions based on harmonic resonance. And I didn't fully understand the question, but just in terms of, I did listen to a little bit of McGilchrist before this talk, and he mentioned that the right hemisphere is lit up around harmony and melody.
Is it working?
Yeah, you got it. We'll get back to you in 2 seconds. Yeah, but you got it.
And that the right hemisphere is responds to rhythm, and especially those strong pounding beats. So it really, it just makes me feel so sad for the young people who are being immersed in this music that's so like the raves and the taking out the harmony and melody that Quan last week so beautifully shared. And but the process of music that brings us, to know life through, it brings us closer to the higher truths. Those people that are contemplating the higher truths seemingly create the most beautiful music that mirrors most closely the natural laws of creation. And so I just really look forward to when you get to be in dialogue with Iain McGilchrist. And I've been really touched again, going back and listening to him from an RTF perspective. And again, Maycee, thank you so much. But just to say, when I'm rereading Science Unshackled too, and Einstein and Max Planck would listen to or play classical music, which would again seemingly bring them into this more unified state, but lighting up that right hemisphere through the harmonies and the melodies.
Yeah, my quick comment on that is that that is definitely an absolute yes. Like you got it like nailed down. It's very true. And I didn't include it in my presentation because I already kind of threw so much at everybody, and I felt so bad. I was like, oh, this is a total information dump. I'm so sorry. But I was going to include in the fact that everything that I described in terms of the right hemisphere's ability to understand the other and the self, the body, the implicit, the notes in between, all of that is in conjunction with how you understand music. How you understand music is almost like how you understand a living person, right? It's and so in his work, he does a very good job to kind of like show that. And he has, you can, when you're reading someone's work, you can see what it is that they're like really passionate about. And he's very, very passionate about music. The way that he writes about it is beautiful. And it is closely linked with our right hemisphere for sure. And you're right in the sense that atonalism that I didn't mention it either, but because I didn't have time, but the right hemisphere or left hemisphere it likes things that are bizarre and absurd. So if that doesn't sound like something that is fragmented and atonal in terms of its mode of attention, then I don't know what does. But yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Maycee.
Arlen,
Yep.
yes, you may go.
Arlen, you got the last question. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Sorry about all the technical difficulties. Sue, I apologize for bumping into there, but doing the best I can. This is not my forte, but here I am. Excellent commentary from all of the people who chimed in at the end. I every time, in the queue, I'm listening to the different people asking questions, and what's on their mind is like, yeah, more about that, more about that. So very much in tune with all of that. Sue's commentary with the music was a great sort of connecting point to a lot of these points. And that actually goes back to what we talked about, Maycee and Calgary. And I'm not sure if it was Maddie or you, but I know we had that conversation specifically about creation, the creative aspect of the mind. And somebody has already touched on the aha moments, a couple comments on that. And as far as does McGilchrist, and real brief, touch or get to the creative source? Like when we talked about music, I was talking about jazz improvisation, that when I was playing and playing at my best, there was no conscious thought in what was coming out of my horn. It was a sound that was flowing through me. And it really was almost more that when I heard the recording of it's like, oh yeah, right. I kind of remember doing that now, but that came from somewhere. And I don't know, in our discussion, I don't think we got to the bottom of it, but the left brain, right brain connectivity, harmony, but then things coming in from even outside of that consciousness. Does he touch on that?
Outside of the consciousness, like when you're in those moments of absolute just doing a thing and being, and so okay, so you're saying, does it come outside of that consciousness?
Has he commented on that?
Has he commented on that?
Because it
yes?
goes back to what I think Kelly was saying about the soul, and then somebody else was talking about the Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost with an inspiration, giving a download, which is what I'm suggesting in something like improvisation or even in art, like we discussed, or writing. Like another gentleman there said, it's in writing where he comes up and puts these things down. And well, where did those thoughts come from? Where did those ideas? So that's a pretty complex, big question. But does he discuss this notion that these injections of creativity that aren't definable by left-right brain function?
Aren't definable by left-right brain function. I feel like he would describe more so like the relationship of them, and I think that he does. So the answer for sure is like yes, in the sense that these concepts are explored. I personally actually, so like funny enough, I feel like I should have just said this at the beginning, not because I was trying to hide something, but I actually haven't. So he has two parts in Master and His Emissary, part 1 and part 2. In part 1, he's actually describing a bit more of what kind of I touched on today, which is like here's some of like the I guess nitty gritty, and then he starts leading up, and of course like all of these bigger contents are kind of entrenched in it, but he starts leading up to, which would be part 2, which is how it's kind of now onto the bigger picture of what's going on in society, but also our relationship with art and music. And so I have to admit that like part 2 of that I haven't even gotten to yet. Like I'm only on part 1, guys. But like, so I would definitely say that it does get touched upon though, because like, my context, Arlen, which is like my family has been doing the hemisphere work though for a bit. Like my dad's read the book 4 times. So, and we've been talking about it nonstop. So I'd say that those concepts definitely do get explored. And like shameless plug here, not gonna lie, but like that kind of helps introduce to the fact that me and my family have actually gone on the I guess mission of our own book study on this specific book, Master and His Emissary. So if you wanted to, it's on at Holmes with Holmes Rumble or YouTube, and we are literally just going through it and reading it. Well, like not reading it, but like we go through sections of it that resonated with us, and then we try to explore these concepts ourselves. And so when we're already actually right about to delve into part 2, so that's why I'm really excited that if you guys decide to go down that further, that'd be great for your minds to explore as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. And Virgil just wrote, my hypothesis, the so-called flow state. Yeah, the creative flow state is presumably when the left and right hemispheres are operating in complete harmony. I see that as the embodiment of the Gestalt, which I think is rather harmonic with what Maycee was describing there. Wow, this has been, that 3 hours flew by, eh? That's that was quite something. But yeah,
I didn't know that it was 3 hours.
No, it's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Before you continue,
Yeah.
Matthew, can I quickly give thank you to everybody who like attended? And I really wanted to say thank you for all of the beautiful comments, because like I feel very challenged, but also like in a very good and healthy way. And so I'm excited to even go back on my presentation. You're all gonna go to my presentation. I'm gonna go to the Q&A and be like, okay. So thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a nice homage to open system thinking, to anti-entropy, and the concept that that we actually live in a creative, ordered universe that is open, growing, yearning to get better. And we all have an attribute, a spark of that, if we choose to grab onto that and to work on it. So, I mean, again, you've introduced a lot of very, very core concepts, very, very high value. So thank you so much, Maycee, for doing that. And thank you everybody for taking the time this Sunday to embark on this journey. And we're going to meet up like usual next Sunday with more. I'll just say it like that, with more. Okay. Bye, folks.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you.